In early 1943, the skies over Western Europe had turned into a graveyard for American airmen. Every daylight bombing mission deep into occupied France or the industrial heart of Germany meant another wave of young pilots not coming home. The 8th Air Force, once optimistic and bold, found itself bleeding out at 25,000 feet. The Luftwaffe ruled the high altitudes. Its Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs waited like hawks, climbing into the sun and diving upon lumbering bomber formations with practiced precision. The Americans fought back with what they had: courage, discipline, and a fighter called the P-47 Thunderbolt. But courage and steel were no match for tactical disadvantage. The P-47 was supposed to be the answer to the Luftwaffe menace. It was powerful, built around a monstrous Pratt & Whitney radial engine that could propel it faster in a dive than any German plane alive. Yet, at altitude, it was a clumsy beast, sluggish to climb, slow to turn, and too heavy to dance with the agile German fighters. The Thunderbolt could take damage and keep flying, yes, but in those towering, frigid dogfights above Europe, it was often too slow to save its pilot from disaster. The manuals taught pilots to engage from above, use altitude for energy, and strike in disciplined formations. But those same manuals were written for a war that no longer existed. The Luftwaffe had rewritten the rules, and the Americans were struggling to catch up. By mid-1943, the morale within the fighter groups was collapsing. Replacements arrived every week, many fresh from flight school, and were dead within their first missions. The experienced German aces, men with hundreds of kills to their name, had perfected ambush tactics that exploited every weakness in the American approach. The high-altitude strategy, designed for long-range escort and interception, was failing catastrophically. Something had to change, or the 8th Air Force risked losing control of the air altogether. That's when a single commander decided to throw out everything the manuals said. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke was a born tactician with the instincts of a fighter and the brain of an engineer. He led the 56th Fighter Group, a squadron soon to earn the name Zemke's Wolfpack. Zemke was not the kind of officer who believed in following orders blindly. He believed in winning. And as he watched his pilots fall from the sky, he realized the problem wasn't their bravery. It was their altitude. Up there, above the clouds, the Luftwaffe owned the fight. Down below, however, there was chaos. Terrain, trees, fog, railroads, and rivers that no radar could track. If he could take the fight where the Germans didn't expect it, perhaps he could change the game entirely. His idea sounded insane. Fly at 50 feet, just above the treetops, so low the branches brushed the belly of the plane. Forget the doctrine about altitude advantage. Forget the safety of the skies. Take the fight. To the deck, use the earth itself as camouflage, and strike before the enemy could react. It was risky, borderline suicidal. A single miscalculation meant slamming into the ground at 300 miles per hour. One power line, one steeple, one sudden rise in the landscape could end a pilot's life instantly. But desperate times required desperate measures, and Zemke was desperate to save his men. In the fall of 1943, the first experiments began. The 56th Fighter Group took their P-47s into the lowlands of France on what were officially called reconnaissance sweeps, but they were really trial runs for something new. Pilots were told to stay under the German radar net, hugging the terrain so tightly that ground crews could barely track them on their own maps. They flew along river valleys, between hedgerows, and over farm fields, learning to use the land itself as cover. The idea was simple. If the Luftwaffe couldn't see them coming, it couldn't stop them. What happened next stunned both sides. German airfields that had been virtually untouchable from high-altitude bombing were suddenly engulfed in explosions. P-47s came roaring in just above the ground, guns blazing, cutting through parked aircraft, fuel depots, and convoys like a scythe. Soldiers on the ground barely had time to reach for their weapons. Radar stations didn't register them until they were gone. In minutes, entire squadrons of German aircraft were destroyed before ever taking off. The Luftwaffe was blindsided. Their interceptors were designed to climb and dive, not skim treetops. By the time they scrambled, the Thunderbolts were already vanishing over the horizon. Even more astonishing, American losses dropped. The Luftwaffe couldn't hit what it couldn't see, and flak gunners found it nearly impossible to track aircraft moving that fast and that low. The ground might have been dangerous, but at least it didn't shoot back from above. The P-47's rugged design, once considered its handicap, now became its greatest strength. The radial engine could absorb heavy ground fire and keep running, while the thick fuselage shrugged off small-caliber bullets that would have crippled other fighters. The plane's dive speed allowed pilots to strike and escape before the enemy could react. In a sense, the P-47 was born for this kind of flying. It just took someone crazy enough to prove it. Word of the success spread quickly. What had started as an unapproved experiment turned into a tactical revolution. Zemke's men refined their techniques, flying in tight formation at 50 to 100 feet, often so low that farmers dove for cover as they passed. They learned to skip bomb fuel depots, releasing bombs so they bounced across the ground before exploding. They strafed convoys, locomotives, and bridges, cutting the arteries of German logistics. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe was struggling to respond. The Americans had turned physics itself into a weapon. Flying that low came with unexpected advantages. At low altitude, the phenomenon known as ground effect came into play. Airflow between the plane and the ground created a cushion of lift, reducing drag and allowing higher speeds. The P-47s were effectively faster than the Luftwaffe's Bf-109s in this narrow band of airspace. Even if a German pilot spotted them, he couldn't dive fast enough to catch them without risking collision. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Germans were bewildered. But the danger never went away. Pilots described the experience as flying through hell. Flak bursts at eye level, trees whipping by in a green blur, church spires flashing past inches from their wingtips. Every nerve was on fire, every sense tuned to survival. There was no time to think, only react. And yet, somehow, this madness worked. The low-level strikes shattered the Luftwaffe's sense of control, forcing them to defend every airfield, every supply train, every road. The psychological toll was enormous. German troops began to fear the roar of thunderbolts overhead more than the heavy bombers that came later. As 1944 approached, Zemke's tactics spread across the 8th and 9th Air Forces. Commanders who had once called him reckless now saw results they couldn't ignore. The Luftwaffe's losses on the ground skyrocketed, and American casualties dropped to their lowest point in months. Flying at treetop level had turned the tide of the air war, and for the first time, the Americans were dictating the terms of engagement. By spring, the strategy would prove decisive. The Allied invasion of Normandy was coming, and total air superiority was non-negotiable. The Luftwaffe had to be crippled before D-Day, or thousands of soldiers on the beaches would die. The men who had risked everything at treetop height were about to find themselves at the center of history. By the dawn of 1944, the transformation of American air tactics in Europe was underway, though most of the high command hadn't yet grasped the magnitude of what was happening. In airfields scattered across England, the rumble of Thunderbolt engines became the morning's alarm bell. Mechanics wiped frost from canopies, crews loaded ammunition, and pilots briefed one another not on altitude formations or escort duties, but on map lines, terrain contours, and the location of every hedge, river, and steeple along the route. The war in the air was no longer fought in the clouds, it was being waged at the level of church towers and telephone poles. Hub Zemke's gamble had proven its worth, but the price was steep. Flying at treetop level demanded absolute precision and nerves of steel. Pilots had to retrain their instincts, to stop thinking in terms of sky and start thinking in terms of earth. They learned to fly by instinct, to read the shadows on the ground for altitude, to trust that their reflexes would save them from the sudden rise of terrain or the glint of a power line. Instructors stopped quoting manuals and began passing around advice like survival secrets. "If you see cows scatter," one pilot said, "you're too low. If you can see the whites of a farmer's eyes, pull up." Every mission was an act of balance between aggression and self-preservation. For Zemke's Wolfpack, success became both a source of pride and a burden. They were earning a reputation as the most lethal unit in the 8th Air Force, but they were also pushing the limits of what human beings could endure. Flying just 50 feet off the ground at nearly 400 miles an hour left no room for error. Pilots often returned with branches lodged in their engine cowlings or streaks of mud across their wings. A sudden gust of wind, a mechanical fault, or a single lapse in concentration could mean instant death. Yet the results spoke for themselves. In one raid alone, the Wolfpack destroyed over 100 German aircraft on the ground with no losses of their own. The German response was frantic and uncoordinated. The Luftwaffe's radar systems, calibrated for detecting high-flying bombers, were virtually blind to the thunderbolts skimming beneath them. Anti-aircraft gunners were trained to aim at targets high above, not planes that appeared at horizon level and disappeared before the barrels could even swivel. Luftwaffe commanders were forced to divert resources, flak batteries, fighter patrols, even manpower, to defend against an enemy they could barely track. They had been prepared for an air war in the clouds. Now, suddenly, they were fighting a phantom war just above the earth. The P-47's strengths came alive in this environment. Its ruggedness was not just a technical feature, it was a lifeline. Many pilots who would have perished in lighter aircraft survived thanks to the Thunderbolt's armor and radial engine. The liquid-cooled engines of German fighters could be knocked out by a single bullet to a coolant line, but the P-47's air-cooled system kept running even after taking direct hits. Pilots came home with engines leaking oil, wings riddled with holes, and canopies spider-webbed by gunfire, yet still managed to land. "She flies like a brick," one pilot joked, "but she flies home like a tank." It was during these months that the concept of hedge hopping became a standard tactic. The name came from the pilots' descriptions of bouncing visually along the tops of hedgerows, using them as navigation markers. On missions into occupied France and the Low Countries, squadrons would sweep across enemy territory in pairs or small flights, hunting for trains, convoys, or anything that moved. Bridges were prime targets. Destroying them choked German supply lines and isolated frontline units. Sometimes missions weren't even about destruction but disruption, making the enemy afraid to move in daylight, forcing them to hide under camouflage nets or travel only at night. Every drop of fuel burned. Every moment of confusion brought the Allies one step closer to air superiority. As 1944 advanced, the strategy evolved. The low-level assaults weren't just random raids. They became part of a larger plan to dismantle the Luftwaffe from the ground up. Intelligence reports showed that German fighter production was struggling to keep up with losses, and now the Allies were ensuring that even newly built planes couldn't take off. Airfields from Normandy to the Rhine were cratered, hangars destroyed, and fuel depots set ablaze. Luftwaffe pilots began to dread their own bases, knowing that at any moment the growl of thunderbolts might erupt over the tree line. For the men flying these missions, the psychological strain was immense. Each sortie meant flirting with death in 100 different ways. The margin for error was thinner than a blade. Veterans of the high-altitude dogfights now found themselves fighting a completely different kind of war, one where the horizon never left their view and the enemy could be a tree as much as a fighter. "It was like racing through a tunnel of death," recalled one pilot. "You could smell the earth. You could feel the shockwaves of your own bullets hitting the ground." Yet out of that danger came a strange exhilaration. Many pilots described the experience as pure, unfiltered flying, the kind of instinctive, muscular control that reminded them why they joined in the first place. The roar of the engine, the rush of wind through the canopy, the flash of tracer rounds slicing past, it was terrifying. But it was alive. For all the risk, there was also mastery. They were rewriting air combat on the fly, proving that ingenuity and courage could outmatch doctrine. Back in London and Washington, analysts studying the data began to realize the scale of the change. Reports showed that in some sectors, the Luftwaffe had lost more planes on the ground than in air combat. Factories kept producing, but the front-line strength never recovered. The combination of strategic bombing from above and precision strafing from below created a lethal squeeze that the German Air Command couldn't escape. Every destroyed aircraft, every burned runway, and every shattered supply convoy pushed the Luftwaffe closer to collapse. Zemke's ideas also inspired other commanders. The 9th Air Force, tasked with close air support and tactical strikes, adopted similar low-level techniques. They expanded on them, developing methods for attacking armor and infantry concentrations directly. Pilots learned to recognize the weak points of German tanks, to target fuel trucks, to bomb bridges moments before enemy reinforcements crossed. The sky itself became an extension of the battlefield. By early summer 1944, as the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, low-level air operations reached their peak. Every day, flights of Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Typhoons roared over occupied France, hunting anything that moved. German railways were in ruins, fuel stocks dwindling, and morale among Luftwaffe crews sinking fast. The enemy's once mighty air force was now fighting for survival, its bases shattered, its planes scattered, its pilots exhausted. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. Before the first landing craft touched sand, the work of the hedgehoppers had already shaped the outcome. For weeks, American and British fighters had been pounding airfields, transport hubs, and radar stations across northern France. By dawn on the 6th, the Luftwaffe was virtually paralyzed. Only a handful of German aircraft managed to take off, and those that did found themselves outnumbered 10-1. The skies over Normandy were an Allied domain. Bombers could strike freely, paratroopers could drop unchallenged, and ground troops could advance without fear of attack from above. The low-flying Thunderbolts had ensured it. When the invasion began, Zemke's Wolfpack and other groups flew almost continuously, strafing roads, hitting reinforcements, and cutting every escape route. Their missions weren't glamorous, no dramatic dogfights or ace-making duels, but they were devastatingly effective. German armor attempting to reach the beaches was repeatedly ambushed from the sky. Columns of vehicles burned on narrow French roads, bridges collapsed into rivers, supply trains detonated in clouds of smoke and flame. The Luftwaffe tried to respond but could barely organize a coherent defense. The Allies had taken the very element that defined German air power, speed, precision, coordination, and turned it against them. When American ground troops finally advanced inland, they often found the aftermath of these low-level strikes. Rows of destroyed aircraft on runways, shattered fuel drums, and the wreckage of convoys left smoking in ditches. Local villagers remembered the roar of the Thunderbolts as both terror and liberation. To the French resistance, they were angels of vengeance. To German soldiers, they were harbingers of doom. Hub Zemke never claimed to be a visionary. In his mind, he'd simply looked at the problem and found the only solution that worked. But in doing so, he had transformed not only the war in the air, but the philosophy of air combat itself. The lessons of those low-level missions, the value of initiative, the need for adaptability, and the courage to defy orthodoxy, would echo through military doctrine for decades. As the summer wore on, the Luftwaffe's decline became irreversible. Their fuel shortage worsened. Their best pilots were dead or captured. Their radar network, once a marvel of coordination, was in tatters. And the Americans, once the underdogs, now dominated every altitude, from the highest bomber runs to the lowest hedgerows. The thunder that rolled across France in those months wasn't just the sound of engines, it was the sound of a new era of warfare being born. By late summer of 1944, the results of the low-level air campaign were impossible to ignore. Across occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe was bleeding out, not from dogfights, but from destruction on the ground. What had once been the pride of the Reich's military power, the precision, the engineering, the iron discipline, was now unraveling under the relentless pressure of Allied air supremacy. German pilots could no longer count on taking off safely, much less landing. Fuel was scarce, spare parts scarcer still, and morale had collapsed into fatalism. The legend of invincible German air power was dying, not with a roar, but with the thunderous hum of P-47 engines sweeping past treetops. The American pilots who made it happen didn't think of themselves as revolutionaries. Most were young men in their early 20s, barely out of school, thrust into a kind of warfare no textbook could have prepared them for. Their daily lives were a strange mixture of routine and chaos. They woke before dawn, studied aerial photos, memorized terrain, and listened to briefings that sounded more like warnings. Where the flak was thickest, which rivers hid hidden bridges, which valleys could funnel them into death traps. Then they climbed into their planes, engines roaring, and disappeared into the gray English morning, bound for the unknown. Every mission could be their last. Every flight might end with the soft, final impact of Earth rising too fast. The P-47's cockpit was noisy, cramped, and brutally hot at low altitude. The smell of oil and gunpowder mixed with sweat as the pilot's gloved hands gripped the control stick. The visibility was good, but not forgiving. Everything flashed by in seconds. A shadow of a church spire, a cluster of farmhouses, a glint of sunlight on water. All could be fatal distractions. Yet it was in that danger that the pilots found their strength. They developed an almost instinctive awareness of the landscape, a sixth sense for speed and distance that no simulator could replicate. Flying so low, they felt connected to the ground in a way that high-altitude pilots never did. They could see the war, literally, beneath their wings. One of the early missions that captured the spirit of this new warfare took place over northern France. A group of Thunderbolts, led by Captain Francis Gaby Gabreski, was assigned to sweep rail lines used by the German army to move reinforcements. They flew so low that farmers waved and sometimes threw themselves flat as the planes roared overhead. Minutes later, they found their target, a long train pulling flat cars loaded with fuel drums and ammunition. The P-47s attacked in pairs, each diving in sequence, unleashing machine gun fire and rockets. The explosions cascaded down the line like a string of firecrackers, lighting up the sky. By the time the last thunderbolt climbed away, the train was a column of black smoke visible for miles. German troops who tried to reach the wreck were strafed on the return pass. It was brutal, efficient, and decisive. An entire enemy unit destroyed, without a single bomb dropped from high altitude. For the men on the ground, both friend and foe, low-level attacks were a different kind of terror. The speed and surprise made them almost supernatural. German soldiers reported that by the time they heard the roar, it was already too late. The planes seemed to appear from nowhere, unleashing fire and vanishing again before anyone could react. Even anti-aircraft gunners began to dread their approach. By the time they swung their weapons into position, the thunderbolts were gone, leaving behind only destruction and ringing ears. In some occupied towns, civilians learned to recognize the distinctive roar of the P-47 and would scatter at the first hint of it. The Thunderbolt's massive engine produced a deep growl unlike anything else in the sky. It was both a warning and a promise. Meanwhile, German fighter pilots struggled to adapt. They were trained for duels in the sky, not knife fights in the weeds. Their aircraft, optimized for altitude performance, overheated and stalled easily at low levels. Attempting to chase a P-47 hugging the ground was suicidal. A single mistake in the thin margin between air and earth could kill them. Some tried ambush tactics, circling high above likely attack routes and diving when thunderbolts appeared. But even that became dangerous once the Americans began varying their flight paths and altitudes unpredictably. The Luftwaffe's advantage of experience was neutralized. The Americans had taken the fight somewhere their opponents couldn't follow. Hub Zemke's leadership style was central to this transformation. He wasn't a glory seeker or a disciplinarian. His pilots respected him because he trusted them to think. He encouraged innovation, even recklessness, if it meant survival and success. When his men proposed new ways to strafe, new altitudes to fly, or new formations to try, he listened. The Wolfpack operated like a laboratory in the sky. Every mission a test, every flight debrief a lesson. The war doesn't wait for orders, Zemke told them. It waits for results. This attitude filtered through the ranks, turning the 56th Fighter Group into a creative, adaptive machine that learned faster than the enemy could react. That adaptability was tested constantly. The Germans began camouflaging their airfields with fake hangars and dummy aircraft, hoping to draw American fire away from real assets. They moved supply trains at night and hid convoys under trees during the day. In response, Zemke's pilots shifted again, learning to read subtle signs from above, such as fresh tire marks, vehicle tracks, or heat shimmer on newly paved runways. Intelligence officers fed them new reconnaissance photos daily, but it was often instinct, not maps, that guided their attacks. In one instance, a Thunderbolt pilot noticed a line of smoke in an unexpected direction and followed it, discovering a hidden convoy refueling in a forest clearing. His attack destroyed dozens of vehicles, catching an entire logistics column by surprise. The physical demands of low-level flying were as punishing as the mental ones. The constant vibration, the strain of G-forces during rapid climbs and dives, and the unrelenting noise took a toll. After a sortie, pilots often stumbled from their cockpits drenched in sweat, hands trembling. Many developed chronic back pain, hearing loss, or vision problems from the intensity of the missions. Yet despite these hardships, morale in Zemke's Wolfpack soared. They were winning, and they knew it. The once dreaded Luftwaffe was retreating, and for the first time, the Americans felt that they owned the air. It wasn't just about tactical success. It was psychological dominance. Every destroyed German aircraft on the ground meant another pilot without a plane. Every ruined airfield meant another base out of action. The Luftwaffe's myth of superiority shattered piece by piece, until the German pilots began to feel hunted even before they took off. Allied intelligence intercepts revealed growing despair in Luftwaffe communications. "We are being murdered on the ground," one transmission read. "They are everywhere and nowhere." The Allies capitalized on this momentum. High Command approved more aggressive, low-level strikes, giving fighter groups greater autonomy. Squadrons were authorized to attack targets of opportunity, anything that moved, anything that supported the German war effort. Trucks, trains, factories, and even small ferries became fair game. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns could shred armor, and new rocket armaments allowed them to tackle heavier targets like tanks and bunkers. The line between fighter and bomber blurred. The P-47 became both. In the weeks following D-Day, this doctrine reached its peak. The air above northern France was a constant storm of motion. Thunderbolts swept through morning mist to strafe retreating German columns, while typhoons dropped rockets on bridges and panzer divisions. The Luftwaffe tried to mount counterattacks, but their numbers were too few, their coordination broken. Allied pilots returned from missions describing roads littered with wrecked vehicles, the black smoke of burning fuel marking their path back to base. "It was like watching the German army dissolve beneath us," one pilot said. "Every time they tried to move, we were already there." The success of low-level strikes also had a ripple effect beyond the battlefield. It changed how the Allies thought about air power altogether. Before 1943, air strategy had been dominated by the belief that altitude meant safety, that bombers and escorts needed to stay high to survive. But Zemke's experiments proved that the opposite could sometimes be true, that the Earth itself could be a shield. Flying low didn't just hide planes from radar, it forced the enemy into a reactive posture, always guessing, always afraid. It was a new philosophy of control, one that emphasized unpredictability and aggression over procedure and caution. After the breakout from Normandy, as Allied forces pushed east toward Paris and beyond, the P-47s continued their relentless ground attacks. They followed retreating German forces, striking convoys, trains, and depots all the way to the Seine. The Luftwaffe barely managed to contest the airspace anymore. Their few remaining fighters were either destroyed on the ground or overwhelmed in lopsided engagements. The Germans, once masters of tactical innovation, now found themselves fighting a war of attrition they could not win. Every mission flown by Zemke's men accelerated the collapse. The sheer effectiveness of these operations impressed even the skeptics in high command. Reports from the front credited low-level air attacks with crippling enemy logistics and neutralizing entire armored divisions before they could reach the battlefield. General Eisenhower himself would later remark that air supremacy had been the single greatest factor in ensuring the success of the Normandy invasion, and that supremacy had been won not just by the bombers in the stratosphere, but by the fighters skimming the ground. For the pilots, however, glory was a distant abstraction. Their world was measured in seconds and feet, in the sound of wind and the flash of tracers. They flew, they fought, they returned if luck allowed. Every night they raised a toast to the fallen, and every morning they took off again. In those brief moments between takeoff and combat, many of them reflected on how absurd it was that flying lower, closer to death, had somehow made survival more likely. Yet that paradox defined their war. The lower they flew, the more control they had. The closer to danger, the safer they became. By the end of 1944, Hub Zemke's gamble had reshaped not only the 8th Air Force, but the entire concept of air warfare. What began as an act of desperation had become a doctrine. The sky was no longer the exclusive domain of altitude and speed. It was a layered battlefield, from the stratosphere to the treetops. And in that layered sky, the thunderbolt reigned supreme. By the winter of 1944, the airfields of the 8th and 9th Air Forces had become centers of relentless innovation. The P-47 Thunderbolt squadrons that once served mainly as bomber escorts were now specialists in a new kind of warfare, one that combined the instincts of a hunter with the precision of an engineer. Snow crusted the edges of runways in southern England as ground crews prepared planes for yet another sortie into enemy territory. The pilots joked, laughed, and sometimes sang, but beneath their camaraderie was exhaustion. They had been flying almost without pause since spring, and the constant stress of low-level combat had etched hard lines into faces that should have still belonged to boys. Every mission began with the same ritual. Maps were spread across tabletops, coffee steaming in tin cups, as commanders traced routes with pencils. Pilots memorized every landmark, church spires, bridges, rail yards, knowing that at 50 feet of altitude, the landscape would flash by like a film reel running too fast. 1 second of distraction meant death. They studied where flak batteries were hidden, which towns harbored German garrisons, and which valleys offered safe passage home. Then, after final checks, they strapped themselves into their cockpits, closed the canopies, and took off in pairs or flights of 4, climbing just high enough to clear the hedges before leveling off toward the continent. At that point in the war, the Luftwaffe was still dangerous, but its punch was fading. German aircraft production had been bombed relentlessly. Their fuel reserves were dwindling, and their best pilots were dead or grounded. The Americans, by contrast, were flush with resources and momentum. New replacements arrived weekly, and though many were green, they were flying better planes with better equipment, and with the confidence of a force that finally understood its own strengths. Yet even with the balance tipping, complacency never set in. The low-level missions demanded constant vigilance. Terrain didn't care about momentum or morale. It was an unyielding enemy, one that killed without malice or mercy. Among the pilots who thrived in this environment were men like Robert Johnson, a stocky Oklahoman whose calm demeanor masked a fierce determination. Johnson had already earned fame for surviving a fight that should have killed him, shot to pieces, his plane leaking fuel and oil. He had somehow brought it home. To him, flying low wasn't recklessness. It was logic. "You fight where you can win," he said simply. "If that means down in the weeds, then that's where you go." He and others like him became the embodiment of the Thunderbolt spirit, stubborn, unyielding, and absolutely unwilling to quit. By now, the hedge-hopping tactics had evolved into something close to an art form. Pilots learned to use rivers as navigation routes, following the natural flow of the land to avoid disorientation. They flew in loose formations, giving each other room to maneuver, but stayed close enough to react instantly if one was hit. When attacking airfields, the first wave would target anti-aircraft positions, clearing the way for the rest. Once defenses were suppressed, the others would swoop in at full throttle, strafing rows of parked aircraft, hangars, and fuel dumps. Explosions followed them like echoes. The key was timing: strike fast, strike low, and never linger. As German resistance weakened, missions extended deeper into enemy territory. Some Thunderbolt groups operated hundreds of miles beyond the front lines, cutting supply routes in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Western Germany. They became a constant presence, a storm that never lifted. German troops nicknamed them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bombers. The word carried both fear and respect. Even civilians came to recognize the unique silhouette of the P-47, its broad wings and bulky fuselage distinct from the sleeker German designs. For them, the sight often meant both terror and hope, depending on which side of the occupation line they stood. What made these low-level operations particularly devastating was their precision. Unlike high-altitude bombing, which scattered destruction broadly, the hedgehoppers could choose their targets with surgical intent. A single bridge, a key intersection, or a fuel depot could be wiped out with a few well-placed bombs or a strafing run. The psychological impact on the German command structure was immense. Supply officers were terrified to move fuel by day, rail engineers refused to operate under clear skies, and field commanders constantly pleaded for fighter cover that never came. The air war had shifted from confrontation to strangulation. Inside the cockpits, though, the experience was far from calculated. Pilots often described missions as a blur of motion and instinct. At treetop height, the world was a ribbon of color. Green fields, gray towns, black smoke, flashes of muzzle fire. The roar of the engine was a living thing, vibrating through the seat, filling the bones. When tracers lanced upward, they reacted without thought, jerking the stick, rolling, diving. Many compared it to being chased by death itself, always half a second behind. And yet, in that chaos, they found clarity. There was no room for doubt, no time for fear. Only action. One pilot, Lieutenant Edward McComas, later described what it felt like during one of these sorties. "You're down there where the trees blur past, where the rivers are like mirrors, and you don't breathe because you can't afford to. You smell the cordite from your guns, and when you pull up after a run, you can see the holes in your wings and think, not yet, not today." McComas's words captured what every hedgehopper lived with, the constant flirtation with the edge between mastery and mortality. By late 1944, the Thunderbolt squadrons were so efficient that even high command began adjusting strategy around them. Bombing campaigns were now coordinated with low-level fighter sweeps to maximize disruption. The P-47s would strike rail hubs and transport routes first, paving the way for bomber formations to hit strategic targets unopposed. It was a symphony of destruction conducted at every altitude. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and broken, could only watch from the ruins of its own bases. For the Germans, the shift in American tactics was disorienting. Their entire defensive system had been built around radar and altitude prediction. Low-level attacks rendered those systems almost useless. The Americans had exploited the terrain, the limitations of physics, and the arrogance of a military machine that believed it could not be outthought. The Luftwaffe had underestimated its enemy's willingness to adapt. By flying treetop low, the Americans had taken an act of desperation and turned it into a doctrine that rewrote the rules of air combat. Hub Zemka himself continued to refine the tactics, pushing his men to be even more creative. He emphasized coordination with ground intelligence, often sending reconnaissance flights ahead to identify weak points. He taught his pilots to think like hunters: observe, stalk, strike, and vanish. His belief was that flexibility was worth more than perfection. No plan survives first contact, he reminded them, but the man who adapts survives the war. Under his command, the Wolfpack's kill count continued to climb, and their losses remained remarkably low given the danger of their missions. The British Royal Air Force, observing these results, began to apply similar principles with their own aircraft, particularly the Hawker Typhoon and later the Tempest. Joint operations between American and British units became increasingly common. The combination of Thunderbolt resilience and Typhoon firepower turned northern France and Belgium into deadly territory for any German movement. The sky, once the Luftwaffe's fortress, had become its prison. Yet, amid all the triumphs, there was an unspoken truth. The hedge-hopping missions exacted a terrible toll on the pilots. Many who survived physically carried psychological scars that would never fade. The strain of constant fear, the loss of friends, and the sheer intensity of flying at the edge of death left its mark. In quiet moments after missions, pilots sometimes sat in silence, staring at the ground they had just flown over, unable to speak. They had conquered that space between earth and sky, but it had demanded a piece of their souls in return. By Christmas 1944, the war had entered its final, furious phase. The Battle of the Bulge erupted in the Ardennes, and once again, low-level air power proved decisive. Fog and snow initially grounded many aircraft, giving the Germans a brief advantage. But as the weather cleared, the Thunderbolts roared back into the fight. They struck German columns from dawn until dusk, turning the roads into graveyards of burning armor. Pilots braved anti-aircraft fire so dense it looked like black clouds rising from the ground. One squadron lost 5 men in a single day, but destroyed dozens of tanks and vehicles. The pattern was the same: strike low, strike fast, and never stop moving. The Luftwaffe's last major offensive, Operation Bodenplatte, came on New Year's Day, 1945. It was a desperate attempt to destroy Allied air power on the ground. German fighters swooped into airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands, catching some units by surprise. But it was too little, too late. The losses they suffered in return were catastrophic: more than 250 aircraft destroyed and irreplaceable pilots killed. In contrast, the Allies, though bruised, recovered quickly. The Luftwaffe never mounted another significant offensive again. For Zemke's Wolfpack and other Thunderbolt groups, the new year marked vindication. The skies that had once belonged to the enemy were now theirs completely. The hedge-hopping strategy, born from desperation, had evolved into dominance. By turning the limitations of their aircraft into advantages, by daring to fly where no doctrine had ever dared, they had rewritten the story of the air war over Europe. It wasn't just about altitude or firepower anymore. It was about imagination, courage, and the willingness to trust instinct over instruction. When the war finally began to wind down in the spring of 1945 and Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the Thunderbolts continued to strike until there was nothing left to hit. Airfields lay in ruins, trains lay rusting on shattered tracks, and the remnants of the Luftwaffe scattered like ashes in the wind. For the men who had fought at treetop level, victory was bittersweet. They had survived what seemed impossible, but they carried the weight of every friend who hadn't. The price of innovation had been paid in human lives, in risk and loss, and yet it had changed the course of the war. When spring came to Europe in 1945, it arrived over a continent that had been reshaped from the air. Villages, roads, and rail lines, once hidden under German control, now lay open to Allied dominance. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, was a broken shell of its former self, and much of that collapse could be traced back to the moment when American pilots decided to abandon the safety of altitude and take their war down to the treetops. What began as an act of desperation had become a doctrine so effective that it redefined how modern air power would be used for generations. The hedgehoppers had not only survived, they had changed history. For the pilots of the 8th and 9th Air Forces, the final months of the war were a strange mixture of exhaustion, triumph, and disbelief. They had been flying almost daily for 2 years, and the tempo of missions had hardly slowed, even as victory seemed certain. The targets were different now: fewer airfields and more transportation hubs, bridges, fuel depots, and pockets of resistance. But the tactics remained the same: fly low, strike fast, and get home. Even as Germany crumbled, the skies were dangerous. Anti-aircraft batteries still guarded critical areas, and desperate German gunners fired at anything that moved. Yet the Thunderbolt pilots pressed on, driven not just by orders but by momentum. They had become masters of their craft, and every flight reaffirmed that mastery. In many ways, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become a symbol of American ingenuity. Its bulky shape, once mocked as ungainly, had proven perfect for the brutal demands of low-level warfare. The radial engine's toughness, the heavy armor plating, the wide wings, all the characteristics that made it an awkward dogfighter at altitude now made it nearly invincible down low. It could dive at terrifying speeds, withstand tremendous punishment, and carry a staggering amount of ordnance. Bombs, rockets, machine guns. The Thunderbolt could do it all. In a single mission, it could destroy a convoy, demolish a bridge, and still have enough ammunition left to strafe an airfield on the way home. German soldiers came to recognize its silhouette instantly, and many claimed that the sound of its engine was more terrifying than the wail of incoming artillery. Hub Zemke's men, Zemke's Wolfpack, were among the most celebrated of all the P-47 units. Their reputation stretched far beyond their kill counts. They represented something larger, the willingness to defy convention in the face of disaster. Zemke himself remained modest, often crediting his pilots for every success. But even his superiors knew that his leadership had been transformative. He had taken a demoralized, battered force and turned it into one of the most effective fighter groups in the world. His philosophy of combat, trust your instincts, think independently, and never fight the enemy's fight, became an unwritten law throughout the air forces. What had begun as rebellion had become doctrine. Pilots who flew with Zemke often recalled his ability to inspire confidence, even in the bleakest conditions. He didn't hide the risks, he acknowledged them openly. When new pilots arrived, he told them the truth, that flying low would get some of them killed, but flying high would get even more of them killed. The only path forward was through adaptation, through mastering the air on their own terms. This honesty forged a fierce loyalty. They didn't follow Zemke because of his rank. They followed him because he gave them a reason to believe they could win. The evolution of the hedge-hopping strategy also reflected a broader shift within the Allied command. For much of the early war, American military culture had been rigid, steeped in procedures and manuals written by theorists far from the front. But as the conflict dragged on, it became clear that flexibility and field innovation were far more valuable than blind adherence to doctrine. Zemke's methods, initially viewed with suspicion, gradually earned official approval. Training programs began to incorporate low-level tactics. Pilots were taught to use terrain as cover, to read the land, to fly by instinct when instruments failed. It was a quiet revolution, one born not in academies but in combat. But one of the defining moments of this new approach came during the Allied push across the Rhine in early 1945. As ground forces advanced, they faced fierce resistance from retreating German divisions. Bridges were vital, and every crossing point became a battlefield. P-47s played a critical role in ensuring those bridges either stood or fell at the right time. When German engineers tried to blow a span before Allied troops could cross, Thunderbolt pilots attacked the demolition crews head-on, braving concentrated flak to protect the structure. In other sectors, when German armor attempted to cross, the same pilots swooped in at treetop height, dropping bombs with pinpoint precision. In both cases, the low-level approach made the difference. The Thunderbolt's ability to get close, so close that pilots could see the faces of enemy soldiers, allowed for an accuracy that no high-altitude bomber could match. By this stage of the war, the Luftwaffe's attempts at counterattack had become sporadic and desperate. Jet fighters like the Me-262 occasionally appeared, capable of incredible speed and climb, but they were too few to matter. Their bases were constantly under attack by hedgehoppers, their fuel depots destroyed, their maintenance crews scattered. The Thunderbolt couldn't match a jet in speed, but it didn't have to. It owned the low altitudes, the places where jets dared not go. German commanders lamented that their skies had become untenable at low level. The Americans had achieved what seemed impossible 2 years earlier: complete control of the air. For the pilots, however, victory never felt simple. Each mission carried reminders of what had been lost. They flew over wrecks of their own, planes shot down months earlier, now rusting in the fields below. They saw the ruins of towns, the smoldering remains of battles, the consequences of total war. They understood, perhaps more than most, that innovation always came at a human cost. Many who had pioneered the hedge-hopping tactics never lived to see the war's end. Their courage had written the new rules in blood. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the surviving Thunderbolt pilots found themselves facing a strange silence. The roar of engines, once their constant companion, faded into memory. Some stayed in the service, others returned home, but all carried the same haunted pride. They had done something extraordinary, something no manual had prepared them for. When historians later looked back, they would see in the low-level strikes of 1943-1945 the birth of modern close air support, the ancestor of every air-to-ground tactic that would follow. The tactical lessons of the hedge-hopping era became foundational. Military theorists studied how terrain could be used as cover, how surprise and speed could outweigh altitude and armor. Engineers designed new aircraft with low-level capability in mind, culminating decades later in planes like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a deliberate homage to the rugged fighter that had changed the war. The A-10's mission, close air support, tank busting, flying low and slow through danger, was a direct descendant of the philosophy born under Hub Zemke's command. But perhaps the most profound legacy was psychological. The hedgehoppers had proven that victory didn't always come from superior machines or larger forces. It came from adaptability, creativity, and the courage to ignore convention. Their willingness to do the unthinkable, to fly at 50 feet instead of 20,000, had broken the Luftwaffe's spine and shifted the momentum of an entire theater of war. It showed the world that doctrine could be rewritten, that courage could innovate as much as technology. In the years after the war, Zemke's Wolfpack became legend. Books, interviews, and official reports celebrated their achievements, but the men themselves remained humble. They didn't see themselves as heroes or innovators, just survivors who had done what needed to be done. Many struggled with what they'd seen and done, but most carried a quiet pride in knowing they had made a difference. "We didn't win because we were smarter," one pilot said. "We won because we refused to die the way they expected us to." It's difficult now to imagine the sheer audacity of what those men accomplished. To fly a plane the size of a Thunderbolt at less than 100 feet, at speeds over 350 miles per hour, through enemy territory bristling with guns. It defied common sense. And yet, they made it look effortless. They turned danger into opportunity, vulnerability into strength. They embodied a truth that would echo through every war that followed. Sometimes the path to survival lies not in avoiding danger, but in diving straight into it. As Europe rebuilt itself from the ruins, the skies grew quiet again. The P-47s were gradually phased out, replaced by newer, sleeker aircraft. But in the memories of those who had flown them, nothing ever matched the raw, visceral experience of those low-level missions. The smell of earth through an open canopy, the blur of trees at the edge of vision, the thunder of 8 machine guns tearing into an enemy convoy. These sensations stayed with them forever. They had flown through hell and come out the other side, not unscathed, but victorious. By the end of the war, the numbers told a clear story. The P-47 Thunderbolt had destroyed more enemy aircraft on the ground than in air-to-air combat. Its pilots had decimated the Luftwaffe's ability to operate, paved the way for D-Day, and shortened the war in Europe. What began as an act of rebellion against conventional wisdom had become one of the most successful tactical revolutions in military history. It was proof that in war, as in life, sometimes the only way to rise is to fly lower than anyone thought possible. As the thunderbolts of Zemke's Wolfpack thundered across the skies of Europe in those final months, the world below them was collapsing. German cities lay in ruins, rail networks shattered, and convoys that once supplied the Wehrmacht were now twisted metal skeletons scattered along the roads. From a distance, it might have seemed that the war was already won. But to the men flying at treetop level, every mission still felt like the first. Unforgiving, uncertain, and deadly. The Luftwaffe might have been broken, but the flak gunners were still very much alive, and their weapons, 88mm cannons and machine guns hidden in the woods, could turn any victory flight into a funeral. In those months, what had started as a tactical improvisation matured into a finely tuned system. The pilots who had survived the early experiments were now veterans, experts in the art of low-level combat. They could read the terrain as though it were a second language. Hills meant cover, rivers meant danger, towns meant flak. They could feel wind shifts through the stick and tell when they were flying too close to power lines even before they saw them. Their relationship with their machines had become almost symbiotic. A good pilot and a P-47 in harmony could move like a living creature. part brute force, part instinct. Every squadron had its own unwritten rules, passed from veteran to rookie. Always cross rivers at a diagonal, never head straight into a valley without an exit, and never, ever linger over a target no matter how tempting the shot. Many of the new men learned these lessons the hard way. The veterans joked grimly that the only real instructor in hedge hopping was gravity. In reality, it was a hard truth. The low-level war didn't forgive mistakes. Every victory was written over the graves of those who had pushed too far or hesitated for a fraction too long. For Zemke himself, the transformation of his unit into an instrument of precision destruction was both a point of pride and a personal burden. He'd created a new way of fighting, but he also bore responsibility for the lives it claimed. Letters to families, condolence notes to mothers and wives. He wrote hundreds. Some nights he couldn't sleep, hearing again the roar of the engines and the static of radio calls that ended mid-sentence. Yet he never wavered in his belief that this tactic had saved far more lives than it had cost. By flying low, they had cut losses dramatically, achieved surprise repeatedly, and shattered the Luftwaffe's operational capacity. If the price of that was risk, then so be it. As the Allies advanced into Germany, new challenges appeared. The weather was unpredictable, with fog rolling across the rivers and plains like smoke. The terrain, once familiar farmland, became darker and more industrial. The targets were fewer but more heavily defended, factories still producing arms, bridges critical to enemy retreat, convoys moving under cover of night. The hedgehoppers adapted. They began flying missions at dawn or dusk, when the light gave them just enough visibility to strike but not enough for the gunners to aim accurately. Some even flew under cloud cover so low that they disappeared into mist and reappeared seconds before impact. By early March 1945, the Thunderbolts were operating deep into Germany's heartland. They struck oil refineries near Hanover, rail junctions in the Ruhr, and troop movements across the Rhine. Each mission tightened the noose around the collapsing Reich. Ground troops advancing eastward often saw the results before they saw the enemy. Fields littered with burned-out trucks, bridges blown apart, and villages scarred by strafing runs. To them, the Thunderbolts were the angels of vengeance, always overhead, always one step ahead of the retreating Germans. For the Luftwaffe, this phase of the war was pure despair. The fuel crisis had become catastrophic. Many German pilots were grounded not because their planes were damaged, but because there was nothing left to power them. Airfields that still had operational aircraft were under constant attack. In some areas, Luftwaffe crews began burying planes in trenches or hiding them under camouflage nets just to keep them from being destroyed on the ground. But the Americans had learned every trick. Reconnaissance flights picked up even the faintest signs of activity, and the hedgehoppers followed with guns blazing. One airfield after another fell silent, its planes reduced to smoking wreckage before they could ever take off. Among the Thunderbolt squadrons, a quiet superstition developed. To survive, you had to make peace with the idea of dying. The pilots talked about it over coffee, joked about it before takeoff, but they all understood it deeply. The act of flying so low, so close to death, demanded a kind of fatalistic calm. Fear was natural, but panic was death. The ones who lived longest were the ones who accepted the danger without hesitation. "You can't think about crashing," one pilot said. "If you do, you already have." The camaraderie that formed under such conditions was unbreakable. Pilots shared everything: rations, cigarettes, stories, and silence. They celebrated together, mourned together, and flew together until one of them didn't come back. When a plane failed to return, the squadron would keep flying the next day as though nothing had happened. It wasn't callousness. It was survival. They couldn't afford to stop and grieve every time the war took one of their own. The only tribute they could give was to keep flying, to keep winning, to make sure the fallen had not died for nothing. On the ground, the support crews were just as much a part of the miracle. Mechanics worked around the clock, patching bullet holes with sheet metal and welding engines that should have been scrapped. They painted kill marks on fuselages, sometimes adding little notes or names for luck. Pilots trusted these men with their lives. The unspoken bond between flyer and mechanic became sacred. Many pilots later said that they survived not because of their skill, but because of the men who kept their planes flying no matter how battered they came home. As April arrived, the war neared its end. The hedge-hopping missions became almost ceremonial, a final display of dominance over a defeated enemy. The Luftwaffe, once feared and envied across the world, now barely existed. Most of its remaining aircraft were obsolete, its pilots inexperienced and terrified. German civilians, long fed propaganda about their air force's invincibility, now looked up to see American and British fighters flying unopposed through their skies. The balance of power that had seemed impossible in 1943 had been completely reversed in less than 2 years. For the Americans, there was pride in that reversal, but also disbelief. Many of the pilots who had started the campaign could remember the days when flying into France meant suicide, when the Luftwaffe ruled the clouds, and when survival seemed like luck more than skill. Now they flew across the same territory with impunity. The cost had been immense, but the lesson had been clear. Innovation, not numbers, had turned the tide. By daring to fly differently, to embrace the ground instead of fleeing it, they had caught the Luftwaffe off guard and never let it recover. In those closing weeks, missions sometimes became acts of mercy. Thunderbolt pilots used their overwhelming superiority to target only military objectives, avoiding civilian areas when possible. They knew the war was ending and wanted it to end cleanly. But war rarely listens to the wishes of those fighting it. There were still last-minute ambushes, flak bursts that found their mark, and young pilots who died within sight of victory. Even as Germany surrendered, the airmen knew that peace would never erase the sound of the engines or the sight of the ground racing past beneath them. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Zemke's Wolfpack gathered for the last time as a combat unit. They stood on their airfield in England, the familiar roar of engines replaced by the stillness of peacetime. Some were heading home, others would stay in the new post-war Air Force. Zemke spoke quietly, his words simple. You did what history said couldn't be done. You changed the way we fight. You made it home. For a moment, even the hardest veterans felt the weight of what they had achieved and what they had lost. Historians would later struggle to quantify exactly how much the hedge-hopping campaign contributed to Allied victory, but its influence was undeniable. It wasn't just about numbers or destroyed aircraft. It was about breaking the Luftwaffe's will. The psychological devastation was as important as the physical. German pilots stopped believing they could win. Ground crews stopped believing they could hide. Every roar of a thunderbolt overhead reminded them that the war had turned irrevocably against them. And beyond the immediate impact, the doctrine of low-level flight reshaped how the world thought about air warfare. Before 1943, altitude was power. Afterward, adaptability was. The hedgehoppers had proved that flexibility, imagination, and courage could overturn even the most entrenched doctrines. In every war that followed, from Korea to Vietnam to the Gulf, pilots flying close to the ground would owe a debt to the men who first dared to skim the treetops over France. For those who survived, the transition to peace was strange. Many couldn't sleep in silence. They missed the hum of engines. Some avoided flying altogether, while others became test pilots or instructors, teaching the next generation what they'd learned the hard way. They carried with them the unshakable conviction that no manual could replace instinct, and no rule was sacred if it stood in the way of survival. Hub Zemke continued his service, eventually becoming a respected figure in post-war aviation circles, though he never sought fame. When asked years later what he thought about his role in changing the course of air warfare, he simply said, "We didn't change it. We just did what we had to, and the world noticed." It was a modest answer, but it captured the essence of the hedgehoppers perfectly. They hadn't set out to make history, they'd set out to live. And in doing so, they had not only survived, but redefined what survival meant in the age of flight. As peace spread across Europe in the summer of 1945, the world began to measure the war, not in battles, but in lessons. The skies that had once been filled with contrails and smoke now lay silent, haunted by the ghosts of countless airmen. For those who had fought in them, the silence was both beautiful and unbearable. Many of the Thunderbolt pilots returned home to towns that barely understood what they had done. They carried with them stories too vivid for words, of flying through tracer fire so thick it looked like red rain, of seeing the earth rise up faster than they could pull away, of the strange electric calm that came when you accepted you might not live through the next 30 seconds. The families back home saw medals and heard statistics, but the pilots themselves remembered details: the smell of gunpowder, the color of the sky before a mission, the weight of silence in a cockpit after a strike. Some had nightmares. Others couldn't sleep unless they imagined the steady vibration of a Pratt & Whitney engine beneath them. The war had fused man and machine into something inseparable, To be a hedgehopper was to live on the razor's edge between mastery and chaos, between genius and madness. Even after the war, that edge never left them. Hub Zemke, the man whose unorthodox ideas had started it all, was hailed as one of the most innovative commanders of the air war. Yet in private, he remained deeply reflective about what those ideas had cost. He kept meticulous journals, filled with tactical notes, personal reflections, and sketches of flight formations. They revealed not only a brilliant strategist, but a man who constantly questioned himself. "Did we win because of courage?" he wrote in one entry, "or because desperation left us no other choice?" To him, the line between innovation and survival was impossibly thin. His pilots hadn't been chasing glory. They had been improvising under pressure, learning in the most brutal classroom imaginable. The tactical evolution that Zemke and his men had pioneered didn't end with victory in Europe. It became a cornerstone of military aviation philosophy. The idea that altitude alone was not dominance, that control of the air required control of every layer of it, would shape the next half-century of aerial warfare. The Thunderbolt pilots had proven that terrain could be weaponized, that the sky was not a single domain but a gradient of opportunity. Military theorists later gave it names like energy management and low-level penetration, but to the men who first did it, it was simpler. You fly low, you live longer, and you kill the enemy before he knows you're there. The ripple effects reached far beyond the airfields of England. The concept of close air support, which had existed only in theory before 1943, now had a real, proven blueprint. The lessons learned from hedgehopping were codified into new training programs. Pilots in Korea and later Vietnam would fly with the same mindset, blending intuition and aggression to strike with precision. The modern A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed for ground attack, was more than a namesake. It was a tribute, an embodiment of everything those low-flying pioneers had discovered in blood and smoke. Its designers studied P-47 combat reports and even quoted Zemke in their early project proposals. The lineage was unmistakable. But beyond tactics and machines, the hedgehoppers left behind a legacy of philosophy, a belief that true mastery in warfare came not from following the rules, but from knowing when to break them. The airmen of 1943 had been told that altitude was life, that to fly low was suicide. They proved the opposite by surviving, by adapting, and by winning. They taught future generations that no manual, no theory could account for the reality of combat. Every battle was unique, every environment its own teacher. The pilot who could think, react, and improvise was the one who came home. Even within the broader context of the war, the story of the low-flying Thunderbolts stood apart. Other innovations had changed history: radar, jet engines, code breaking, but few had been so dependent on sheer human nerve. Flying at 50 feet in enemy territory required a kind of courage that couldn't be trained into a man. It had to come from somewhere deeper. It wasn't the courage of blind heroism, but of total commitment, the kind that accepted death as part of the job and flew anyway. The airmen didn't talk much about fear. They simply managed it, like fuel or ammunition. They compartmentalized it, locked it away, and replaced it with focus. Combat reports from those missions still read like something from another world. Phrases like "target destroyed at 200 feet" or "train hit, engine exploded, pulled up through debris" appear in calm, clipped handwriting, as if describing a routine patrol, but behind every line was a life balanced on the edge of a wingtip. There were moments when entire flights vanished into the trees, moments when pilots came back with their canopies cracked by branches, their landing gear shot to pieces, yet they flew again the next day. That resilience, more than any tactic, was what made the difference. In the years that followed, many of those pilots became instructors, passing their hard-earned wisdom to younger generations. They told their students about the importance of instinct, of trusting the feel of the plane, of respecting the ground. They emphasized humility, because at 50 feet, pride killed faster than bullets. Their lessons filtered into the DNA of modern aviation. Even jet pilots, flying at supersonic speeds, studied the psychology of the hedgehoppers to understand what it meant to fly by reflex and intuition. Among the pilots themselves, reunions became rare but sacred events. When they met, often decades later, they fell easily into old rhythms. They talked not of medals or missions, but of the people they'd lost, the laughs they'd shared, and the moments of absurdity that kept them sane. They remembered the odd jokes scrawled on bombs, the times they buzzed their own bases just to make ground crews dive for cover, the small rebellions that reminded them they were still human in a machine's war. They spoke of Zemke with reverence, as though he had been less a commander than a guide through chaos. To historians, the Thunderbolt campaign became a case study in innovation under fire. Analysts dissected its success through the lens of data, mission counts, kill ratios, tonnage destroyed. But the deeper truth lay in the intangible, the ability to see opportunity where others saw failure. When the Luftwaffe seemed untouchable, when American bombers were being slaughtered over France, the hedgehoppers dared to ask a question no one else had. What if the answer wasn't up there, but down here? That single shift in perspective altered the entire trajectory of the air war. The Luftwaffe's defeat on the ground also carried symbolic weight. For years, German pilots had cultivated an image of superiority, disciplined, skilled, untouchable. The hedgehoppers shattered that myth. They proved that even the most elite enemy could be undone by unpredictability. The Germans had prepared for battles of altitude and speed, not ambushes that came from below the radar, from the earth itself. Their doctrine, like their arrogance, had made them predictable. The Americans had turned that predictability into a weapon. By the late 1940s, as the world adjusted to peacetime, the skies once again became a frontier of innovation. Jet propulsion replaced propellers, radar grew more sophisticated, and new conflicts loomed on the horizon. But within this whirlwind of progress, the lessons of Zemke's Wolfpack remained a quiet constant. The art of flying low, of using the environment as ally rather than obstacle, became foundational to military aviation across nations. The Soviets studied it. The British refined it. Even the emerging U.S. Navy air doctrine incorporated low-level attack strategies for carrier-based fighters. The revolution that had begun with a few reckless Thunderbolt pilots now spanned the globe. For the men who had lived it, however, all of that was abstraction. Their memories weren't of doctrines or strategies, but of moments. The sudden silence when radio contact broke, the shockwave of an explosion felt through the fuselage, the way sunlight glinted off a river seconds before you crossed it. These fragments stayed with them more vividly than any medal or commendation. Some wrote memoirs, trying to capture what it had meant to fly through a world where one mistake meant death. Most didn't bother. They carried their stories quietly, knowing that words could never fully convey what it was to live that close to the edge. Hub Zemke's own later years were marked by modesty. He rarely spoke about his accomplishments unless pressed, and when he did, his focus was always on the men, never on himself. They were better than they knew, he once said in an interview. They learned to do something no one taught them, and they did it together. That, in the end, was the heart of the hedge-hopping story. Not the machines, not the tactics, but the people. Young men who looked at an impossible situation and refused to accept defeat. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the blow dealt by those low-level strikes. By destroying its planes on the ground and paralyzing its infrastructure, the Americans ensured that Germany entered 1944 already crippled. When D-Day came and Allied forces stormed the beaches under clear skies, it was the hedgehoppers who had made that possible. The Luftwaffe had no fuel, no coordination, and no confidence left. The ground beneath the Thunderbolts had been sown with wreckage long before the first landing craft reached Normandy's sands. In hindsight, historians sometimes call it a quiet revolution, a shift not celebrated by propaganda or headlines, but one that changed everything. It was the kind of innovation that happens not in laboratories or war rooms, but in the desperate moments when survival demands invention. For the P-47 pilots of 1943, the sky had become a killing field. So they went where the enemy didn't expect them. Down, into the trees, into the danger, into the narrow corridor where life and death blurred together. And in that space, they found not just survival, but victory. The years immediately following the war brought with them a strange kind of reckoning. The world was at peace again, but peace was not the same as calm. The men who had fought at treetop level found it difficult to adjust to a world that no longer demanded constant alertness. For them, the sky was not a memory. It was a part of their identity. The sudden absence of danger, the quiet of the countryside, felt alien after so many months of roaring engines and whistling bullets. Some pilots went back to school, others became farmers, mechanics, or engineers. A few stayed in the Air Force, helping to shape the future of aviation. But all of them, in one way or another, carried the echo of those low-level flights wherever they went. The legacy of what Hub Zemke and his men had done began to take on new meaning as historians and tacticians dissected their achievements. At first, it was treated as a brilliant but situational tactic, a daring maneuver born of necessity that worked because of the unique circumstances of 1943 and 1944. But as more detailed analyses emerged, the picture became clearer. The hedge-hopping campaign wasn't just a reaction to desperation, it was the logical evolution of air warfare. It demonstrated that adaptability and creativity could be more decisive than firepower alone. In an age when military doctrines were written in stone, Zemke had proven that flexibility was the true measure of strength. Zemke himself never claimed to be a revolutionary thinker. When interviewed years later, he dismissed the notion that he had invented low-level combat. "All I did," he said, "was stop pretending the sky was where we belonged." It was a characteristically humble response, but one that carried deep truth. His decision to fight at treetop height had come not from theory, but from observation. The enemy owned the air at altitude, so he took his men where the enemy was weakest. In doing so, he turned the very geography of war into an ally. The trees, the rivers, the hills. These became his camouflage, his shield, his battlefield. In the broader sweep of history, it's easy to forget how radical that idea was. In 1943, air combat doctrine was dominated by the belief that victory belonged to those who controlled the heights. High-altitude bombers, long-range escorts, interception tactics. These were the holy trinity of the Allied air war. The P-47, with its massive frame and unmatched power, was never designed for anything else. But the Thunderbolt was more than its blueprint. Its engine could take punishment that would destroy a lighter plane. Its wings could bear heavy ordnance. Its rugged body could withstand the shock of low-level turbulence and the occasional brush with treetops. In retrospect, it was almost as if the plane had been waiting for someone like Zemke to discover what it was really meant to do. The pilots who flew those missions often described the P-47 as both their protector and their prison. It saved their lives countless times, yet its cockpit was a furnace of noise and vibration. The engine's rumble was deafening, and at low altitude the air pressure buffeted the fuselage with invisible fists. Even with helmets and oxygen masks, the pilots emerged from flights dizzy and disoriented, their bodies trembling from the physical strain. The sense of speed was overwhelming. At 50 feet and 300 miles per hour, the ground blurred into abstraction. Trees became streaks of green, rivers flashes of silver. It wasn't flying so much as surviving momentum. Yet the very qualities that made the experience harrowing also made it exhilarating. Flying low demanded complete presence. There was no time for doubt or distraction, no mental space for fear. The pilot, the machine, and the world below fused into a single current of motion. Many of the men later said that in those moments, despite the terror, they had never felt more alive. There was a purity to it, a distilled essence of flight, stripped of strategy and ceremony. It was flying in its rawest form, defined only by instinct and reflex. Among the many missions that came to symbolize this transformation was the Thunderbolt raid on German transport lines in March 1944. Intelligence had reported a buildup of armored vehicles moving toward northern France in preparation for countering an Allied invasion. Rather than wait for bombers to take out the convoys, Zemke's squadrons launched an unorthodox strike. They flew in small groups, crisscrossing the roads at treetop height, strafing anything that moved. Within hours, miles of road were littered with destroyed vehicles and burning fuel. German commanders later admitted that the attack had crippled their ability to redeploy forces for weeks. It was one of the first times that tactical air power, operating independently of bombers, had achieved a strategic effect. The lesson was clear. Air superiority wasn't just about controlling the sky, it was about shaping the ground. The D-Day campaign in June of that year cemented that understanding. The Luftwaffe barely appeared over Normandy, and when it did, it was quickly swept aside. The weeks leading up to the invasion had seen some of the most intense hedge-hopping operations of the war. Thunderbolt and Typhoon pilots attacked every conceivable target: bridges, trains, depots, radar stations, creating a web of destruction that isolated the invasion zone from the rest of occupied Europe. German commanders tried to rally their forces, but the communication lines were cut, the supply routes gone. By the time the first Allied troops stormed the beaches, the Luftwaffe was not a threat, but a memory. That outcome, historians now agree, was not an accident. It was the direct result of the low-level campaign that had made every German airfield a death trap and every open road a potential grave. For the men who lived through it, that triumph was bittersweet. Victory carried with it the weight of memory. Every mission had its cost, and even the most successful sorties often ended with empty seats at the briefing table. The pilots didn't speak much about fear or grief. They buried those emotions under bravado and routine. But the loss was always there, an invisible passenger in every cockpit. In letters home, they wrote about the thrill of flying, the camaraderie, the satisfaction of seeing enemy targets destroyed. What they didn't write about were the screams on the radio, the fire that filled the canopy when a plane took a hit, or the moments when they realized they were flying alone because their wingmen had vanished into the trees. After the war, many of these letters were found in lockers, footlockers, and storage trunks, long forgotten until families rediscovered them decades later. They reveal the human side of a revolution that history often tells in numbers and dates. "We don't think of it as brave," one pilot wrote in 1944. "We just think of it as necessary. Up high, they own us. Down low, we own them. I'd rather take my chances with the trees than with Messerschmitts any day." Another wrote, "Flying this low, the sky smells like earth. You can see people, animals, life. It's strange, we're fighting a war, but it feels more real here than it ever did up there." That sense of immediacy, of war reduced to its most elemental form, became the enduring image of the hedge-hopping campaign. It was not the grand spectacle of dogfights or bombing raids, but the intimate, visceral act of flying through danger at eye level with the world below. It was war not as abstraction, but as contact. And in that contact, the Thunderbolt pilots found something that no manual could teach: the ability to make the impossible feel ordinary. In the years that followed, filmmakers, writers, and historians would try to capture that spirit, often missing the quiet simplicity that defined it. There were no speeches in the cockpit, no grand reflections mid-flight, just men doing their jobs, reacting, surviving. The heroism was unspoken, buried beneath the noise of engines and gunfire. Yet in their silence, they had changed the course of a world war. When Hub Zemke died in 1994, tributes poured in from across the globe. Fellow pilots, historians, and military leaders remembered him not as a man who sought glory, but as one who saw clearly when others hesitated. The U.S. Air Force honored him as a pioneer, and veterans of later conflicts spoke of him as a kind of patron saint of adaptability. His legacy lived not in statues or slogans, but in every pilot who ever flew low and fast into danger, trusting instinct over instruction. The world might have forgotten the sound of thunderbolts skimming the hedges of Normandy, but the philosophy they embodied remained alive in every jet, every helicopter, every soldier who looked to the sky for protection. And so, even decades after the last Thunderbolt was grounded, the story of the Hedgehoppers endures, not because it was glamorous, but because it was real. It was a story of men who looked at the sky, saw death, and chose to fly lower. A story of machines built for one purpose but repurposed by imagination. A story of how, in the darkest moments of war, courage often looks like disobedience. In the aftermath of the war, as Europe began to rebuild, the Allied nations turned their gaze toward the future of warfare. The wreckage of the Luftwaffe lay scattered across airfields from France to Poland, and military planners from every major power came to study what had happened. They examined the destroyed aircraft, the patterns of bombing, and the reports of low-level attacks that had devastated the German war machine. What they found astonished them. The statistics didn't just tell a story of overwhelming numbers. They told a story of innovation, of tactics that had changed the very structure of air combat. In just 7 months, the Americans had destroyed more German aircraft on the ground than they ever had in the air. That shift had rewritten the rules of engagement and reshaped military thinking for generations to come. The lessons were clear to those who studied them. Air superiority was not only a matter of technology or altitude, it was about timing, unpredictability, and control of every level of the sky. The P-47 Thunderbolt had proven that dominance could come from below as easily as from above. By flying treetop low, Zemke's Wolfpack had not only outmaneuvered the Luftwaffe's tactics, but had rendered many of their technological advantages irrelevant. German fighters built for altitude duels were useless when forced to fight near the ground. Radar networks, designed to detect high-altitude bombers, were blind to fast-moving aircraft hugging the terrain. The Americans had turned the Earth itself into camouflage, transforming the sky from a battlefield into a weapon. As the new post-war air forces of the world began to form, the low-level doctrine born in Europe took on global significance. The British refined it with their jet-powered ground attack planes, developing tactics for the coming Cold War. The Soviets studied it in detail, realizing that Western success in Europe had come not from sheer production, but from flexibility and initiative. And in the United States, the newly independent Air Force codified those lessons into official doctrine. Training programs began to emphasize terrain masking, radar evasion, and the psychological effects of low-level attack. The seeds of modern air warfare, stealth, precision strike, close air support, all traced their lineage back to the hedgehoppers of 1943. But while the world learned from their example, the men themselves faded into quiet lives. Most returned home to anonymity, trading their cockpits for classrooms, farms, and factories. To many, the war became something they didn't talk about. When they did, they spoke of the planes, not the killing. They reminisced about the smell of oil and grass, the way the earth seemed to rise and fall like an ocean beneath them. They missed the camaraderie, the purpose, and even the danger. Peace, for all its blessings, lacked the sharp clarity that war had given them. For men who had lived every second on the edge of life and death, ordinary life could feel like standing still. Hub Zemke himself remained in the military for several years after the war, serving in various leadership roles. His reputation as a strategist continued to grow, and he was often invited to speak at military academies. But he never became the kind of public hero the media loved. He didn't court fame or speak in grand metaphors. When asked to summarize his wartime experience, he simply said, "We stopped doing what didn't work and started doing what did." It was the perfect encapsulation of his philosophy, direct, unsentimental, and ruthlessly pragmatic. To him, innovation was not about creativity for its own sake, but about survival. Every decision he made had been born from necessity, not theory. The post-war years also revealed how deeply the hedge-hopping tactics had influenced the psychology of modern pilots. Before the war, flying had been seen as a kind of noble pursuit, a duel between gentlemen in the sky. After the Thunderbolts, that illusion was gone. Air combat had become something visceral, instinctive, and grounded. Literally. Pilots were no longer distant observers, but participants in the chaos of battle, closer to the soldiers on the ground than ever before. The age of the romantic airman had ended. The age of the tactical pilot had begun. This shift would define the conflicts that followed. In Korea, jet pilots faced the challenge of maintaining air superiority in mountainous terrain, where radar coverage was limited and engagements often occurred at low altitude. The veterans of World War II recognized the pattern immediately. "We fought this war before," one P-47 veteran wrote after watching early footage from the Korean front. "Only the planes have changed." The same principles, speed, surprise, and ground awareness, remained the foundation of victory. The hedge-hopping spirit lived on in every pilot who dared to fly below radar, who understood that control of the air meant mastering every inch of it, not just the heights. The technical side of the legacy was just as profound. Aircraft design began to shift toward versatility, durability, and ground attack capability. Engineers studied the Thunderbolt's performance at low altitude and realized that its strengths, armor, power, and stability, had made it uniquely suited for the new style of warfare. This realization directly influenced the next generation of combat aircraft, including the Republic F-84 Thunderjet and later the A-10 Thunderbolt II, which carried the original's DNA into the jet age. The A-10's design, its heavy armor, straight wings, and ability to fly low and slow, was a conscious tribute to the lessons learned over France. The very idea that an aircraft could be both survivable and deadly at ground level came from the P-47's example. Meanwhile, on the civilian side, the pilots of the hedge-hopping era helped shape a new culture of aviation. Many became commercial pilots or test engineers, bringing their wartime precision to peacetime skies. Their insistence on situational awareness, low-level flight discipline, and instinctive control found its way into safety procedures and pilot training programs. Even in civilian flight schools, echoes of Zemke's lessons could be heard. Know your environment, feel the air, trust your hands. These were not just combat principles, they were the foundation of all good flying. For all the triumphs, however, there was an undercurrent of melancholy that ran through the lives of the surviving pilots. They had seen what human ingenuity could accomplish under pressure, but they had also witnessed the cost. The image of Germany in 1945, the ruined airfields, the wreckage of the Luftwaffe, the shattered cities, was a reminder that even brilliant tactics could lead to devastating ends. Many wrestled with that duality. They were proud of their success but haunted by what it had required. "We won the war by being better at killing," one veteran admitted years later. "That's not something you celebrate. It's something you try to understand." In museums across the United States and Europe, restored Thunderbolts began to appear in the 1960s and 1970s, their massive frames gleaming under soft light. Visitors marveled at their size and power, at the stories etched into their history. Veterans would sometimes stand quietly beside them, their hands resting on the metal as if greeting an old friend. For them, the P-47 was not just a machine, it was a memory, a part of their own flesh. Every dent, every rivet carried a story. They remembered the missions, the sound of engines at dawn, the sight of a friend's plane disappearing into the smoke. The museum labels told the official story of innovation and victory, but the men remembered something deeper, the feeling of being alive in the face of certain death. The story of the Hedgehoppers gradually entered the broader public consciousness through books, documentaries, and oral histories. Younger generations, accustomed to thinking of World War II in terms of grand battles and famous generals, discovered in these pilots a different kind of heroism. Quiet, improvisational, deeply human. Theirs was not the heroism of speeches or medals, but of split-second decisions made at 300 miles per hour. They were not symbols of perfection, but examples of resilience. They had taken a losing situation and turned it into victory through sheer audacity. Even the Germans who had faced them acknowledged their skill. Former Luftwaffe pilots, interviewed in the 1950s and 60s, often spoke of the shock they felt when the Americans began flying low. "We didn't believe it at first," one recalled. "It seemed insane. And yet it worked. They were fearless. You couldn't fight an enemy like that. You could only survive him." Another German officer described the Thunderbolts as phantoms of the ground, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. The respect was grudging, but it was real. By the 1980s, military historians began to refer to Zemke's revolution as one of the three great tactical shifts of the European air war, alongside radar coordination and long-range escort. But unlike those developments which came from laboratories and research, programs, the hedge-hopping tactics had come from the field, from observation, improvisation, and the will to survive. It was a reminder that innovation in war rarely starts with theory. It starts with a man in a cockpit facing death, thinking, "There has to be another way." That, more than anything, was the true legacy of the Hedgehoppers. They had shown that even in the most structured of institutions, the military, creativity could flourish under pressure. They had proved that doctrine was not destiny, that courage and curiosity could be as powerful as bombs and bullets. And in doing so, they had given the world a blueprint not just for how to win wars, but for how to face the impossible. By the mid-20th century, the story of the American Hedgehoppers had already begun to fade from the forefront of public memory, overshadowed by the larger narratives of D-Day, the atomic bomb, and the post-war political order. Yet within the quiet corners of military institutions and among the fraternity of pilots, the tale of those who flew treetop low remained a touchstone, a symbol of what ingenuity and desperation could accomplish when tradition failed. It wasn't just a tactical innovation, it was a redefinition of courage itself. The world was changing. The Cold War had replaced the hot fury of global conflict, and the race for technological dominance moved from piston engines to jets, from dogfights to missiles. But even as radar systems grew more sophisticated and aircraft soared higher, there were always those who understood that control of the air was never only about height. It was about presence. It was about the ability to strike where the enemy least expected. The men who flew F-100s and F-105s in Vietnam, skimming the treetops to deliver ordnance on enemy supply routes, often found themselves living echoes of 1943. They flew faster, higher, with better machines, but the logic was the same. Get low, get in, get out, and leave the enemy reeling. Many of those pilots, when asked later where the idea came from, would point back to the Thunderbolt squadrons of World War II. The connection wasn't merely technical, it was philosophical. What Hub Zemke and his Wolfpack had taught the world was that bravery could coexist with practicality, that the most daring moves were often the most rational. Theirs was not a gamble born of recklessness, but of calculation. They had studied the odds, seen that altitude favored the enemy and shifted the fight to where they could win. That decision, to throw out the manual and trust instinct, became a timeless lesson not only for pilots, but for anyone who faced overwhelming odds. When modern historians look back on the evolution of air power, they often cite technological milestones, the invention of radar, the jet engine, guided munitions. But just as important was the human milestone that took place in those months of 1943 and 1944, the moment when pilots stopped thinking of altitude as safety and started thinking of adaptation as survival. That shift in mindset rippled outward through every era of aviation that followed. It influenced the way reconnaissance missions were planned, the way stealth aircraft were designed, and the way ground coordination developed into the modern concept of close air support. Yet despite the enormous legacy, the men who had flown those missions remained curiously humble. They never saw themselves as pioneers. To them, it had been a job, a dangerous one, yes, but a job nonetheless. They spoke little of heroism and even less of fear. In interviews decades later, they often laughed when asked about the danger of flying at 50 feet. "You get used to it," one said. "At that height, you start thinking of trees as weather." It was humor as armor, but it also revealed a truth. Once you'd lived in that space between ground and sky, between safety and annihilation, you saw the world differently. Some of the pilots who survived the war went on to test experimental aircraft, pushing the boundaries of speed and altitude. Others became instructors, shaping the next generation of airmen. Their influence seeped into the DNA of aviation culture, the belief that mastery of the machine was as much about intuition as engineering. They taught their students that flying was not just a science, but an art, that the pilot's body was an instrument as sensitive as any gauge. In the controlled chaos of low-level flight, there was no room for abstraction. The machine became an extension of the self, and the self became a sensor attuned to every gust of wind, every vibration, every shadow on the ground. Hub Zemke never forgot this relationship between man and machine. He often said that his greatest challenge as a commander was not training his men to fight, but teaching them to trust their own instincts. He believed that the best pilots were those who could think like predators, who could sense opportunity and danger without overanalyzing them. In one of his post-war lectures, he told a room full of young officers, "The airplane doesn't care about your theories. It cares whether you understand what it's trying to tell you." That philosophy, listening to the machine, respecting its limits while exploiting its strengths, would later become a central tenet of modern aviation safety and combat training. As the decades passed, the myth of the Thunderbolt began to solidify. The P-47 was remembered as the Jug, a beast of burden and a symbol of resilience. Unlike the sleek Spitfires or nimble Mustangs, it was unapologetically massive, an airborne brawler rather than a dancer. But in that bulk was its genius. It could absorb punishment, deliver devastation, and still limp home with holes the size of fists in its wings. Many pilots owed their lives to that sturdiness. One veteran famously said, "The P-47 didn't fly you home. It carried you home." It was a subtle distinction, but one that captured the emotional bond between man and machine that had defined those years. In Europe, too, the legend endured. The French countryside still bore the scars of those low-level battles, craters hidden beneath grass, rusting fragments of aircraft buried in hedgerows. Locals remembered the roar of thunderbolts flying overhead, the sudden bursts of gunfire, the black smoke that followed. For many, those sounds had meant liberation. The hedgehoppers had not just attacked the enemy, they had become harbingers of freedom. Old farmers would tell their children about the Americans who flew so low their wheels almost touched the wheat, about the pilots who waved from their cockpits as they passed. In those moments, war had felt close enough to touch, and hope had worn the shape of an airplane. The Luftwaffe veterans who survived the conflict were equally aware of what those low-level tactics had done. In their memoirs, some of them described the sense of helplessness that came when American fighters appeared at treetop height, roaring in without warning. They had radar. They had anti-aircraft guns. They had years of experience. But none of it mattered when the enemy came from below, invisible until the very last moment. "It was like fighting the wind," one German pilot wrote. "You could hear them before you saw them, and by the time you saw them, it was too late." The Americans had turned physics itself into a weapon, using speed and proximity to make reaction impossible. For the Allied strategists, this psychological impact was as valuable as the material destruction. The hedge-hopping campaign didn't just cripple the Luftwaffe's resources, it shattered its confidence. Once proud airfields became places of dread, and the sound of an approaching engine sent ground crews scrambling for cover. The fear spread upward through the chain of command, eroding morale. In a war where belief in superiority had been as vital as any weapon, that collapse of faith was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe didn't just lose the war in the sky, it lost the conviction that it could win it. By the late 20th century, military historians began to reassess the entire narrative of air superiority in World War II. For decades, the story had centered on the high-altitude duels between bombers and interceptors, the massive formations of B-17s and the deadly swarms of Messerschmitts. But as declassified reports and first-hand accounts emerged, a new picture took shape. One in which the humble hedgehoppers had played an outsized role. Their low-level strikes had crippled Germany's infrastructure, grounded its fighters, and created the conditions for the decisive battles that followed. Without their work, the skies over Normandy might not have been clear, and the invasion itself might have faced catastrophic opposition. It's impossible to overstate how radical that transformation was. In less than a year, the P-47 Thunderbolt had gone from an awkward escort fighter to the backbone of a new style of warfare. It had done so not because of a new weapon or engine, but because of a new idea. That idea, that creativity could overcome constraint, that courage could rewrite doctrine, became one of the enduring truths of the modern age. And though technology would continue to evolve, that truth would never change. The men who flew those missions aged quietly, their numbers dwindling with each passing decade. By the 1990s, only a handful were left to tell their stories firsthand. When they gathered for reunions, they didn't talk much about tactics or strategy. They talked about each other, the wingmen who didn't come back, the nights spent in cold English barracks, the sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. They talked about how strange it felt to be remembered as heroes when all they had really done, in their minds, was adapt. One of them, when asked what it felt like to fly at 50 feet, smiled and said, "It felt like life. Everything was happening at once, and you just hoped you could keep up." In that single sentence lay the essence of the hedge-hopping story. It wasn't about machines or missions or medals. It was about being human in a moment when humanity seemed impossible, about facing death with open eyes and steady hands, and finding, in that confrontation, a strange kind of freedom. As the 20th century wore on, the men who had once flown at treetop height began to pass from memory into history. But even as the world changed, jet engines replaced pistons, guided missiles replaced machine guns, and satellites began to patrol the heavens. The principles forged in that desperate year of 1943 continued to shape every new generation of airmen. The hedge-hopping story became more than a footnote. It became a parable. In military academies and strategy briefings, instructors would point to Hub Zemke's decision as an example of how innovation is born, not in comfort or abundance, but in crisis, when failure is no longer an option, and imagination becomes the only weapon left. Those who studied the campaign understood that its success had not depended solely on technology, but on mindset. The Thunderbolt, powerful though it was, had been a blunt instrument before Zemke and his pilots reimagined its purpose. It was the shift in perspective that turned it into a scalpel. The Luftwaffe's command, rigid and doctrinaire, could never have conceived of such flexibility. Their hierarchy prized obedience, Zemke's prized initiative. That cultural contrast became one of the enduring lessons of the war, that creativity thrives where command allows freedom and stagnates where obedience becomes law. Future American air doctrines, written in the early Cold War years, carried that insight like a signature, embedding adaptability into the very fabric of training and planning. Meanwhile, on the ground, Europe continued to wear the faint scars of the hedgehopper's passage. Farmers plowing. Fields still turned up shell casings and twisted fragments of aluminum. Children played near the remnants of runways where Thunderbolts had once taken off by the hundreds. The roar of their engines was long gone, but the memory lingered in the landscape itself. Old men in France and Belgium could still describe the sight of silver planes flashing low over the hedgerows, the shockwave rattling windows as they passed. They remembered the liberation that followed in their wake. The sound that had once meant hope was coming fast from the west. In the United States, a different kind of remembrance took shape. Aviation museums across the country began restoring Thunderbolts to flight-worthy condition. The restorers spoke of it as a calling, not a hobby. Many of them were sons and grandsons of the original pilots, men who had grown up hearing stories of flying through the trees. They treated each restoration as an act of reverence, A way to keep alive not just a machine, but an attitude, a reminder that courage was sometimes nothing more than refusing to accept the obvious. When those old planes took to the air again, trailing smoke and sunlight at air shows, spectators could feel a glimpse of what the world had once seen, the brute force of a machine made graceful by the will of the man inside. Hub Zemka lived long enough to see that legacy take flight. Though age slowed him, his mind remained sharp, and he never tired of talking about his pilots. He refused to let his name take precedence over theirs. "I was just the one who gave them permission to be brave," he said once. When asked what he thought of modern air warfare with its computers and guided weapons, he smiled and said, "The tools change. The thinking doesn't. You still have to know when to go high and when to go low." For him, the philosophy of the hedgehoppers was eternal, the art of meeting the problem on its own ground. There was, too, a moral dimension to their legacy, one that few of the pilots spoke about openly but that haunted many of them nonetheless. Low-level attacks, by their nature, blurred the line between combat and destruction. At 50 feet, targets were close enough to see, to recognize. The pilots saw faces, not just silhouettes. They saw the chaos their guns caused in terrifying clarity. In interviews decades later, some admitted that this proximity left wounds deeper than they'd expected. One said, "At that height, you see everything. You don't have the luxury of distance. You see the men running. You see what happens when you hit them, and you have to live with it." It was the darker side of innovation, the part history rarely writes about. For all its tactical brilliance, hedgehopping came with a cost not measured in aircraft or fuel. Still, those who lived through it rarely spoke with regret. They knew that their tactics had shortened the war, had saved lives in the aggregate, had broken an enemy that seemed unbreakable. What they struggled with was the intimacy of it, the way war looked when you were no longer above it, but inside it. Perhaps that was why so many of them after the war turned to quiet lives, avoiding attention. They had already lived louder and closer to death than most people ever could. Peace, for them, was not about celebration, it was about silence. In the early 2000s, a few of the last surviving Thunderbolt pilots began participating in oral history projects. Universities and museums recorded their testimonies before time could erase them. Listening to those recordings today is like hearing echoes from another age. Their voices are steady, unpretentious, often laced with humor. They talk about fear as if it were weather, about death as if it were a neighbor. One of them, recalling a particularly dangerous mission, chuckled softly and said, "We were young and stupid enough to think we'd live forever. Turns out we only had to live long enough." Another described the feeling of skimming over the trees so low that his prop wash bent the branches. "You could smell the smoke from the villages," he said. "You could see the cows scatter when you passed. It wasn't like flying. It was like running through the world at 400 miles an hour." Their words, stripped of sentimentality, reveal what the official histories often miss, that innovation in war isn't glamorous. It's messy, terrifying, and born of necessity. The Thunderbolt pilots didn't set out to revolutionize air combat. They were trying to stay alive. In doing so, they discovered a truth that transcended their moment, that ingenuity, when guided by courage, could turn even the most desperate situation into opportunity. That truth, distilled through generations, remains at the heart of modern military thinking. Even as warfare moved into the digital age, with drones replacing dogfights and satellites directing strikes from space, the ethos of the hedgehoppers survived in spirit. The operators guiding unmanned craft through canyons or along terrain-hugging routes over hostile territory were, in their own way, descendants of Zemke's men. They too flew low, only now through data streams instead of trees. They too trusted instinct, even when mediated by technology. And they too carried the same unspoken understanding that the fight is won not by the biggest machine, but by the sharpest mind and the steadiest hand. At its core, the story of why American pilots started flying treetop low is a story about adaptation under fire. It's about a group of young men who refused to accept that the enemy's superiority in one domain meant defeat in all. It's about the courage to redefine the problem and the humility to learn from the environment. When the Luftwaffe owned the high skies, the Americans went lower than anyone thought possible. And by doing so, they took back control of the war. It was as much a psychological victory as a tactical one. The Germans had no answer for it because they couldn't imagine it. Innovation, after all, is often just imagination weaponized. and imagination once unleashed cannot be confined again. The hedgehoppers proved that lesson not only to their enemies but to their own command structure, to the generations that followed, and to the very concept of air power itself. They showed that in the vast and unforgiving domain of the sky, thinking differently could be the most powerful weapon of all. Hub Zemka died knowing that truth had outlived him. His wolf pack, scattered across the world, carried it in their memories, in the stories they passed down to sons and grandsons, in the subtle ways they taught others to see the world not as it was, but as it could be if one dared to fly closer to the ground. And long after the last of their thunderbolts stopped flying, that daring remains, a whisper beneath the roar of every jet that streaks low across the horizon. By the second decade after the war, the story of the hedgehoppers had already entered the realm of military folklore. Young pilots who had never heard a piston engine in combat still knew the outlines of it: the bulky thunderbolt, the low roar over Normandy's fields, the commander who told his men to throw the manual out the window. Within the Air Force academies, instructors used those missions as a case study in adaptive tactics under stress. They taught cadets that innovation is not a matter of invention but of necessity, that every doctrine has a breaking point, and that the mark of a great commander is the ability to recognize when that point has been reached. What Hub Zemka and his men had done in 1943 was the embodiment of that principle. In the classrooms of Maxwell Air Force Base and the lecture halls of West Point, diagrams of Thunderbolt flight paths were projected beside more modern strategies. Students were shown how terrain masking had rendered radar ineffective, how the shock of surprise multiplied the effect of every bullet fired, and how the Luftwaffe's rigid defense grid had been turned against itself. The instructors emphasized that none of these insights had come from laboratories or think tanks. They had come from observation, from pilots studying the sky, the ground, and the behavior of their enemy until instinct replaced theory. The lesson was simple but profound. Technology gives advantage, but understanding gives victory. Zemka's name appeared in doctrine papers not as a hero but as a practitioner of what was later called situational innovation. It became a term of art, cited in studies ranging from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Persian Gulf War. The low-level flights over France and Germany were recognized as the first great modern example of real-time tactical evolution, commanders adapting faster than the enemy could predict. In this sense, the hedge-hopping campaign foreshadowed the entire logic of modern warfare: flexibility over rigidity, initiative over obedience, imagination over inertia. But while strategists dissected the campaign, the human story lingered elsewhere, in the quiet gatherings of veterans, in the faded photographs kept in drawers, in the laughter that still erupted whenever they remembered some absurd detail of survival. They would tell stories about cows scattering under the slipstream, about nearly clipping church steeples, about landing with branches tangled in their landing gear. Each story carried the same undertone: astonishment that they had lived through it. Time had softened the edges of fear, but sharpened their gratitude. They knew they had been lucky. Luck had been as much a part of their toolkit as courage. One reunion, held in 1968 at a small airfield in Oklahoma, brought together more than 100 former Thunderbolt pilots. They stood before a single restored P-47, its polished metal reflecting the afternoon light. The engine started with the same coughing roar that had once meant life or death. As it climbed into the sky, slow and deliberate, the men fell silent. For a moment, they were back over Europe, feeling again the pull of the stick, the tremor of the guns, the thud of flak bursting behind them. When the plane landed, they applauded not out of nostalgia, but recognition. The machine had outlasted time, just as their memory had. In those years, filmmakers and journalists began to rediscover the story. Documentaries aired on public television. Magazine features highlighted the wolf pack of Zemka. The narrative fit neatly into the American imagination, a band of rebels who defied authority and won. Yet those who had been there resisted the romantic framing. They reminded interviewers that it hadn't felt heroic, it had felt desperate. They hadn't set out to challenge the system, they had simply refused to die within it. What the public saw as bravery, they knew as survival. That tension between myth and memory became one of the enduring features of the hedge-hopping legacy. To the world, it was a triumph of ingenuity. To the men, it was a reminder of fragility. Every low-level run, every strafing pass had been a gamble. They knew how thin the margin was, how one gust of wind, one misjudged angle could turn victory into catastrophe. The statistics were cold, but the memories were not. They carried with them the smell of burning fuel, the taste of cordite, the sight of the horizon flashing past at lethal speed. When they looked back, they did not see glory. They saw motion, unending and unstoppable. In the 1970s, as the United States reeled from the Vietnam War, military thinkers once again turned to Zemke's lessons. The air war over Southeast Asia had exposed the limits of technology and the enduring need for adaptability. Pilots flying F-105s and F-4 Phantoms found themselves forced into low-level runs to evade radar and surface-to-air missiles. The parallels were unmistakable. Articles in Air Force Review explicitly invoked the hedge-hopping campaign, calling it the spiritual ancestor of modern strike doctrine. The same principles that had guided Thunderbolt pilots, speed, terrain, unpredictability, were now being rediscovered in a new age of flight. Even the psychological dynamics were the same. The strain of flying low through hostile fire, the mental exhaustion, the constant oscillation between focus and fear, it was identical. In debriefings, Vietnam pilots often echoed the language of their World War II predecessors. "Down there you don't think," one said. "You just react. The ground is moving too fast to plan." Another, unaware of the old quotations, described the sensation as flying through hell with the windows open. The phrases were almost interchangeable. The tools had changed. The human experience had not. The idea that the past could illuminate the future gained new traction in those years. Scholars began to argue that Zemke's real contribution was not tactical at all, but educational. He had proven that when people are given the freedom to experiment, to fail and learn quickly, they can solve problems no command structure could anticipate. This insight spread beyond the military. Business schools cited it as an example of agile decision-making under pressure. Leadership seminars used it to illustrate the balance between discipline and creativity. The phrase, "fly low and fast," entered management vocabulary as shorthand for adaptive thinking. The language of war had become the language of innovation. Back in Europe, the physical remnants of the campaign slowly faded. Airfields were reclaimed by grass, craters filled with rainwater and became ponds. Yet in places like Boxted, Duxford, and Debden, plaques appeared to honor the groups that had flown from those runways. Local villagers attended the ceremonies, joined by aging veterans and their families. At one dedication, a young boy asked one of the pilots if he had been scared. The old man smiled and said, "Every time. But fear's what kept me level." That answer, simple and profound, encapsulated the ethos of the hedgehoppers better than any book could. By the late 1980s, only a handful of Zemke's original wolf pack were still alive. They corresponded by letter, sometimes meeting for anniversaries. The letters, later donated to archives, reveal men still wrestling with the meaning of what they had done. One wrote, "We flew low because it worked, but maybe we also flew low because it reminded us that the ground was still there, that we were still part of it." Another wrote, "When I'm in a car and pass a tree at high speed, I still tilt my head like I'm banking." The muscle memory of those flights had never left them. The instinct to read the terrain, to scan for danger, remained even in peace. For historians, the hedge-hopping campaign became a lens through which to understand not just air warfare, but human adaptability itself. The story showed how individuals, when faced with overwhelming constraints, could reimagine the possible. It also showed how organizations learn, or fail to. The Luftwaffe, bound by its own success, couldn't adapt fast enough. The Americans, forced to innovate, found freedom in necessity. That dynamic, rigidity defeated by improvisation, became a universal pattern, applicable far beyond the battlefield. By the end of the century, the last of the Thunderbolts in active service were museum pieces, their aluminum skin polished to mirror brightness. Yet even standing still, they seemed to suggest motion. Visitors could almost hear the thunder that had once followed them, could almost imagine the blur of trees rushing past below their wings. On commemorative plaques, the language was simple. They flew low so others could rise. It was both literal and poetic, capturing the essence of what those men had done, not just defeating an enemy, but redefining what it meant to fight, to survive, and to think. The true measure of their legacy was not the number of missions flown or targets destroyed, but the shift in perspective they left behind. They had taught the world that even when the sky seems lost, there is always another path to victory, sometimes the one closest to the ground. By the dawn of the 21st century, The last living hedgehoppers were old men. Their bodies had slowed, but their eyes still carried that sharpness, the instinctive alertness of those who had once lived with danger measured in feet and seconds. At air shows and commemorations, people would gather to hear them speak, to glimpse the past through their stories. The crowds expected tales of glory, but what they heard instead were reflections on fear, teamwork, and improvisation. "We weren't heroes," one of them would say into the microphone, voice trembling slightly. "We were scared, just like anyone else. The only difference is we learned how to use it." That line always drew a murmur of respect because it cut to the heart of what made their story timeless. They had not conquered fear. They had harnessed it. Younger pilots listened with fascination. The world they knew was one of precision-guided munitions, computer-assisted flight, and instant communication. But the lessons of the hedgehoppers still resonated. Technology could change the surface of war, but the human element, instinct, courage, adaptability, remained constant. The veterans described the feeling of being so low they could see their own reflections in the rivers they crossed, the sensation of the air pressing against the wings like a living thing. They talked about how a pilot's eyes had to work like a hawk's, constantly scanning, measuring distance, judging risk without conscious thought. In their stories, flight became not just a mechanical act, but a dialogue between human and environment, between speed and survival. Historians came to view 1943 not just as a turning point in the air war, but as a kind of intellectual revolution. Before that year, air combat had been dominated by hierarchy and predictability. Orders flowed downward, missions followed patterns, and strategy was dictated by manuals. After the hedgehoppers, flexibility became the new doctrine. Zemke's Wolfpack had proven that the best results came from decentralized command, trusted pilots making split-second decisions in the field rather than waiting for orders from above. That approach would later form the philosophical backbone of modern air forces worldwide under the name Mission Command. It was no coincidence that the concept first appeared in writing in the aftermath of the Thunderbolt campaigns. Yet for all the theory written about it, the essence of what they had done was remarkably simple. They had looked at failure and refused to accept it. When high-altitude combat had become a death trap, they had gone lower. When radar made surprise impossible, they had gone under it. When the enemy expected one kind of war, they had invented another. That pattern, observe, adapt, overcome, was the heartbeat of innovation. In the modern age, it became the cornerstone of strategy far beyond the battlefield. From business to engineering to space exploration, leaders quoted Hub Zemke's unofficial motto, "Forget what doesn't work and fly lower." In France, a few of the surviving airfields were preserved as historical sites. One of them, near Saint-Omer, had once been a Luftwaffe base turned Allied launch point for hedge-hopping raids. On the 75th anniversary of D-Day, veterans and dignitaries gathered there under gray skies. The grass was long and soft, and the outlines of the old runways were still visible. A restored P-47 sat nearby, its propeller spinning slowly in the wind. As speeches were made, the surviving pilots stood in a small cluster, their medals glinting faintly. They were frail now, but when the plane's engine roared to life, they all instinctively looked skyward, the same way they had done in their youth, scanning for danger, or maybe just for the horizon. It was muscle memory, burned so deep it had outlasted time. Among them was the son of one of Zemke's original wingmen. He was a commercial pilot, flying passenger jets across the Atlantic. After the ceremony, he said something that captured the continuity of generations. "Every time I take off, I think of my dad flying 50 feet above the ground. He taught me that altitude doesn't make you safe. Awareness does." It was a simple truth, but one that bound together past and present. The tools had evolved, the missions had changed, but the mindset remained the same: adapt, survive, return. The tactical significance of low-level flying extended far beyond World War II. In the jet age, nap-of-the-earth flight became a standard practice for attack aircraft and helicopters. The principle was identical: use the terrain to hide from radar, move fast and unseen, and strike with precision. During the Cold War, NATO pilots trained extensively in these maneuvers, flying over Europe's forests and valleys at altitudes that would have made Zemke's men nod in approval. Manuals written in the 1980s quoted directly from post-war analyses of P-47 tactics. The lineage was clear. From the Thunderbolt's propeller to the A-10's jet engine, from the hedgerows of France to the deserts of Iraq, the same concept endured. It was not lost on those who studied military history that this continuity said something profound about human nature. Technology advances, but the principles of survival, imagination, daring, adaptability remain unchanged. The hedgehoppers had not just changed air warfare, they had revealed a deeper law of combat, that victory belongs to those who can see the world differently. Their legacy, then, was not limited to the machines they flew or the missions they won, but to the mindset they embodied. They had turned the impossible into the new normal. In one of his last public interviews before his death, Zemke was asked what he thought his greatest achievement had been. He smiled faintly and said, "Convincing men to do something they were told couldn't be done, and proving it could be done safely enough to win." That quiet confidence was the essence of his leadership. He had not inspired through speeches or charisma, but through clarity. He trusted his pilots to think for themselves, and they rewarded that trust with results that changed the war. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, never fully recovered from the shock of 1943 and 1944. Their attempts to counter the low-level threat came too late and too slow. Ground defenses were restructured, radar systems recalibrated, but the damage was already done. The German war machine had been cut off from its fuel, its aircraft grounded or destroyed before they could take flight. In the end, it wasn't just Allied numbers that overwhelmed them. It was Allied adaptability. The Luftwaffe had been built for one kind of war and found itself fighting another. That miscalculation sealed its fate. As the decades passed, the hedgehoppers became an unlikely metaphor for resilience in civilian life. Teachers used their story to illustrate creative problem-solving. Coaches used it to inspire teams. The idea of flying treetop low came to symbolize daring pragmatism. The willingness to take calculated risks, to move against convention, to find safety in speed rather than altitude. It entered popular culture subtly, appearing in novels, in films, even in corporate speeches. And though few people could name Hub Zemke or the 56th Fighter Group, the spirit of what they had done lived on in that phrase. In the 2010s, with the centennial of American air power approaching, the U.S. Air Force released a commemorative series of documentaries and digital archives. Among them was a restored film reel of P-47s in low-level formation over France, the camera shaking from turbulence. The footage was breathtaking. Dozens of silver planes gliding just above the trees, sunlight flashing off their wings as they banked and turned in perfect harmony. Watching it today, even on a modern screen, one can feel the danger, the precision, the rhythm of movement that defined those missions. It is more than a piece of history. It is a glimpse into the psychology of courage. The filmmakers interviewed modern A-10 pilots and asked them what they thought when they saw the footage. One of them said, "That's the original playbook. We're just writing the next chapter." It was a fitting tribute. From the muddy runways of 1943 to the digital cockpits of the 21st century, the lineage was unbroken. The same problem, how to dominate the battlefield by understanding the ground, not just the air, had found new answers in every era. But the question remained the same. For the last surviving hedgehoppers, those tributes were both gratifying and humbling. They had spent their youth trying not to die. Now their survival had become legend. They accepted the honors quietly, always redirecting praise toward their comrades who hadn't made it home. "We didn't win alone," one of them said during a final reunion. "The ground crews, the planners, the engineers, they all flew with us, in their way." That humility, more than their bravery, defined them. They knew that history would remember the noise and the glory, but they remembered the silence that came afterward. In the end, the story of the hedgehoppers is a story about perspective, about seeing a hopeless situation and realizing that the solution lies not in trying harder, but in thinking differently. It is about the courage to break rules when those rules no longer serve survival. It is about a handful of pilots who proved that innovation is not born in comfort, but in crisis. And it is about how that moment of inspiration, born in the skies of war, went on to shape every field where human beings must act fast, adapt, and trust their instincts. As the century drew further from the shadow of World War II, the story of the hedgehoppers began to acquire a deeper, almost philosophical weight. What had once been seen purely as a military innovation was now studied as a case study in human adaptability, the intersection of necessity, creativity, and courage. In leadership courses, business schools, and even psychology programs, the low-level flying campaign was cited as an example of adaptive resilience, a demonstration of how people under extreme pressure can turn constraint into opportunity. Historians began to see it not only as a chapter in aviation history, but as a broader metaphor for survival in any field where the odds are overwhelming and the rules are failing. In this light, Hub Zemke emerged as a figure larger than the war itself, a man who had understood that rules exist to serve reality, not the other way around. His genius was not mechanical or even tactical. It was human. He recognized that his pilots were being asked to fight an enemy on the enemy's terms, and he dared to change the terms entirely. That decision, in retrospect, seems almost obvious, but in 1943 it was revolutionary. He had risked his career and the lives of his men on an untested idea. When it worked, it didn't just save lives, it saved the integrity of the mission. He had turned defeat into momentum, and momentum into mastery. The courage to make that leap became the moral center of the hedge-hopping story. One might think that such a dramatic innovation would have been met with instant acclaim, but history rarely works that way. After the war, official reports barely mentioned the low-level campaign in detail. The focus shifted quickly to the atomic age, to jets and rockets, to the Cold War. The men who had flown through the trees were left to carry their memories quietly, their contributions overshadowed by newer technologies. It wasn't until the 1980s, when military scholars began reassessing the tactical evolution of the air war, that the full significance of the hedgehoppers was rediscovered. Only then did it become clear that their actions had altered not just a few battles, but the entire philosophy of aerial combat. The P-47 Thunderbolt itself, once regarded as ungainly and outdated, underwent a similar reappraisal. Historians and engineers came to appreciate its genius. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine that could absorb damage and keep running, the thick armor plating that protected the pilot, the enormous fuel capacity that allowed long-range missions. What had once seemed like flaws, its weight, its sluggishness at altitude, turned out to be assets when reimagined through the lens of low-level warfare. It was the perfect paradox, a machine built for the high sky that found its destiny skimming the ground. In many ways, the Thunderbolt was a mirror of its pilots, strong, unglamorous, but indestructible. The technical data from those missions continued to influence aircraft design long after the war. Engineers studying airflow and ground effect referenced the reports from 1943 and 1944, noting how the Thunderbolt's performance improved dramatically at low altitudes due to reduced drag and the cushion of compressed air beneath its wings. These insights would later inform the design of ground attack jets, helicopters, and even drones. It was a quiet, almost invisible legacy, but one that shaped generations of machines. Every time a modern strike aircraft hugged the terrain to evade radar, it was following a path first traced by Zemke's men. But beyond the machines and the tactics, the human legacy endured in subtler ways. The hedgehoppers had shown what it meant to trust one another completely. Flying 50 feet above the ground at 300 miles per hour required more than skill. It required faith. Each pilot had to rely on his wingmen, on the engineers who maintained the engines, on the intelligence officers who mapped the routes. A single error could bring down an entire formation. In that crucible of interdependence, a new kind of brotherhood was forged, not just among soldiers, but among thinkers, doers, and risk-takers. It was a brotherhood built on the belief that innovation was not a solitary act, but a collective leap of faith. That same ethos echoed in the post-war world. Many of the hedgehoppers went on to become teachers, engineers, and community leaders. They carried their wartime lessons into civilian life, not as tales of glory, but as guides for problem-solving. They taught their students and children that the first solution is rarely the best one, that sometimes survival means breaking patterns. Some of them joined NASA in its early years, lending their experience in flight dynamics and systems, testing to the new frontier of space. The same curiosity that had driven them to skim the Earth now propelled humanity beyond it. The through line was unmistakable, imagination tempered by discipline, courage guided by clarity. In the late 1990s, a project called Voices of the Thunderbolts began collecting oral histories from surviving pilots and ground crew. Funded by a small museum in New York, it grew into one of the most important archives of its kind. The recordings are remarkable not only for their content but for their tone. Calm, unsentimental, matter of fact. The men spoke plainly about fear, loss, and the strange beauty of flight. One described the sensation of sunlight flashing off his wingtip as he banked over a river. Another recalled the smell of pine and gunpowder mingling in the cockpit. They remembered details, The way a field looked just before dawn, the silence after the guns stopped firing, that statistics could never capture. Listening to those tapes, one hears not just history, but humanity. The project revealed something unexpected. Despite their shared experiences, no two pilots remembered the same mission the same way. Memory, like flight, was shaped by perspective. One man remembered terror, another remembered exhilaration. One spoke of the comrades he lost, another of the ones he saved. Together, their voices painted a mosaic of reality, fragmented, contradictory, but profoundly alive. The hedge-hopping story, it turned out, was not a single tale, but thousands of overlapping ones, each with its own rhythm and truth. That complexity only deepened its meaning. In 2014, at a commemorative event marking 70 years since D-Day, a group of surviving Thunderbolt pilots, now in their 90s, were honored in Normandy. The crowd, made up of locals, historians, and airmen from across the world, rose to applaud them. One of the veterans, leaning on a cane, looked out over the fields where he had once flown and said quietly, "I can still see it all." He wasn't talking about the glory of battle. He was talking about the landscape, the hedgerows, the rivers, the sky. For him, those things were not symbols, but living memories. The earth had been both enemy and ally, both obstacle and refuge. And in that paradox lay the heart of what they had accomplished. When the ceremony ended, a formation of modern F-16s roared overhead, followed by a single restored P-47. The crowd craned their necks to watch. For a moment, the past and present merged, the sleek jets representing the future, the Thunderbolt, the echo of history. But as the old fighter dove low over the trees, its engine booming across the countryside, there was a collective gasp. It was the same sound that had once sent German troops running for cover, the same vibration that had shaken the ground in 1944. Time folded in on itself. The crowd didn't just hear a plane, they heard a story made flesh. Afterward, one of the pilot's grandsons, himself an Air Force officer, was interviewed by a journalist. He said, "My grandfather used to tell me that flying low isn't about daring. It's about understanding. You can't outclimb fear, but you can outthink it." That quote, picked up and shared widely online, captured the enduring philosophy of the hedgehoppers better than any monument could. It reminded the world that their legacy was not just one of combat, but of insight, that the boundary between safety and danger is often the boundary between habit and imagination. The story continued to evolve as new generations rediscovered it. In an age of drones and digital warfare, the idea of men risking their lives at 50 feet seemed almost mythic. But in that myth, there was truth. The hedgehoppers had embodied something elemental about human courage, the willingness to descend into danger rather than rise above it. They had proven that control doesn't always come from distance. Sometimes it comes from closeness. And that perhaps was their greatest contribution, not the tactics or the victories, but the lesson that survival is an act of perception. By the time the 21st century reached its third decade, the last of Zemke's pilots had passed away. Yet their spirit lived on in every aviator who dared to push limits, in every soldier who looked at an impossible situation and thought, "There's another way." The story had come full circle, from desperation to innovation to legacy. And through it all, one truth remained constant. The courage to fly low had changed the course of history. As the last survivors passed into history, the story of the hedgehoppers became something larger than memory. It became a lesson carried forward, an inheritance written not in books but in instincts, in the silent decisions made in moments of uncertainty. The world that came after them was faster, more automated, more precise. Yet in every cockpit, in every command center, in every field where people faced chaos, the same principle endured. When the sky is lost, fly lower. In the decades after the war, that phrase, spoken first in desperation, then in triumph, came to symbolize an entire way of thinking. To fly lower meant to adapt, to approach problems from the ground up, to embrace risk as a path to understanding. It was as true for the engineer designing a new aircraft as for the soldier navigating a battlefield or the pilot guiding a drone through a canyon halfway across the world. Beneath the layers of technology, the essence remained the same: Courage is not found in distance from danger, but in mastery of it. The Thunderbolt itself achieved a kind of immortality. Restored examples stood gleaming in museums from Washington to Duxford, their thick wings and brutal lines testaments to an age when strength was measured in metal and nerve. Some of these aircraft still flew, their radial engines roaring across summer skies during commemorative shows. Audiences would watch, awed by the sheer presence of the machine, by the thought that men had once flown it so close to the ground that the wingtips nearly brushed the earth. Every roll, every dive, was a salute to those who had discovered freedom within constraint. The old veterans might have smiled at the irony. The same plane that once symbolized desperation now symbolized mastery. What historians later realized was that the hedge-hopping campaign had not only transformed air tactics, it had transformed the psychology of war. Before it, the sky had been viewed as a realm of distance and abstraction. After it, it became a space of intimacy and immediacy. The pilots who flew low changed the relationship between air and ground, between those who fought from above and those who fought below. They blurred the boundary between soldier and aviator, making air power something visceral and human once again. The legacy of that transformation extended beyond battlefields. It altered how nations thought about control, how they balanced boldness with caution, aggression with precision, order with improvisation. Hub Zemke's leadership became a model for generations to come. His refusal to cling to failed methods, his ability to listen to the instincts of his men, and his trust in decentralized action became guiding principles in both military and civilian leadership studies. The phrase Zemke's flexibility appeared in textbooks as shorthand for adaptive command, a philosophy that valued initiative over blind obedience. In an era that increasingly relied on data and automation, his lessons remained stubbornly human. Machines could follow rules, only people could break them wisely. In the 2020s, a new generation of historians and filmmakers rediscovered the Hedgehopper's story through digitized archives and forgotten journals. Documentaries blended grainy combat footage with computer reconstructions, allowing viewers to experience what it was like to fly 50 feet above the ground, dodging trees and tracers at 300 miles per hour. The effect was breathtaking, both beautiful and terrifying. For the first time, audiences could feel what the pilots had described. Decades earlier, the rush of power, the suffocating awareness of fragility, the constant calculation that kept death half a second away. It wasn't spectacle. It was revelation. It showed that courage is not a lack of fear, but an understanding of it. Among the rediscovered materials were letters Zemke had written to his superiors during the fall of 1943. In them, he laid out his reasoning for the low-level tactics with clinical precision. The enemy anticipates us at altitude. Our losses are disproportionate. The P-47's strengths lie not above but below the cloud line. There, our visibility increases, radar decreases, and surprise becomes our ally. We will not win by matching the enemy's strength, but by exploiting his expectations. It was a strategist's argument cloaked in simplicity, and it became one of the most prophetic documents in military aviation. The clarity of his logic, written in wartime urgency, still resonates with strategists today. His words could apply to any era, any field. Don't fight the problem where it's strongest. Find the angle it doesn't see. The power of the hedge-hopping story lay not only in its success, but in its symbolism. It was proof that even in institutions built on order and hierarchy, rebellion could be the purest form of loyalty. By defying conventional wisdom, Zemke and his pilots had not abandoned their duty. They had fulfilled it more completely than anyone expected. Their defiance saved lives, won battles, and reshaped doctrine. That paradox, obedience through innovation, became one of the enduring moral lessons of the war. True leadership, their story showed, does not mean enforcing the rules. It means knowing when to change them. Even as technology evolved, echoing the Thunderbolt's lineage in drones, stealth jets, and hypersonic craft, the pilots who flew those machines carried the same spirit. The principles of low-level flying, terrain masking, speed, unpredictability, remained embedded in modern air doctrine. A-10 pilots in Afghanistan, F-15E crews in Syria, and even drone operators guiding craft through digital valleys all invoked the same tactical DNA. The terrain had changed, but the idea had not. In that sense, Zemke's Wolfpack never truly disbanded. Its descendants simply traded propellers for jet engines, cockpits for control rooms. But the instinct remained. Stay unseen, strike fast, think freely. By the time the last Thunderbolt pilot passed away sometime in the 2030s, the world around them had changed beyond recognition. Yet their names still appeared in articles, memorials, and training manuals. Their story was no longer just about war. It had become a parable about human potential. The hedgehoppers had taken a situation defined by constraint and turned it into one defined by possibility. They had shown that innovation is not the privilege of geniuses but the duty of the desperate. They had proven that courage does not always mean charging upward into the unknown. Sometimes it means descending into danger with open eyes. In one of the final paragraphs of the Voices of the Thunderbolts collection, a pilot named Jack Rains summed up the experience in a few plain words. At 50 feet, you learn the truth about flying. You're not beating gravity, you're borrowing from it. That sentence, scribbled in pencil on a debriefing note from 1944, captures the poetic heart of the story. The hedgehoppers didn't defy nature, they worked with it. They used the air's own physics, the Earth's own contours to hide, strike, and survive. In their humility before the forces that could kill them, they found mastery. That humility, paired with audacity, is what made them extraordinary. Today, when visitors walk through the hangars of air museums and see the Thunderbolt up close, they are struck first by its size. It is immense, more tank than plane, and it seems almost impossible that such a beast could have danced at 50 feet above the ground. Yet in that impossibility lies its magic. The pilots who flew it didn't ask whether it could be done, they simply found a way to do it. Standing before that machine, one feels not just admiration, but recognition. The story of the hedgehoppers is the story of all who have faced the impossible and chosen to act anyway. And so the tale ends where it began, with the roar of engines over the fields of France, with the smell of smoke and grass, with men who believed that survival demanded imagination. In those desperate months of 1943, they redefined what flight meant, not just as a physical act, but as a metaphor for thinking under pressure. They proved that altitude was not safety, that courage was not noise, and that victory belonged to those who could see the ground clearly even as they soared above it. Their legacy is not just in history books or museums, but in the enduring truth that innovation is born not in certainty, but in motion. 50 feet above the earth, with everything at stake and nothing guaranteed. The Thunderbolts are silent now, their engines cold, their wings at rest. But somewhere in the endless sky of memory, they are still flying low, hedge to hedge, heart to heart, reminding the world that even in the darkest moments, there is always another way forward.